Fort Benning, Georgia, December 7, 1941. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds of Fort Benning as Captain Thomas Reynolds stood watching his men complete their drills. At 32, Reynolds cut an imposing figure among the other officers. Tall, with broad shoulders, his face weathered by years of training in all conditions, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a natural leader. The men called him Thunder, not just for his commanding voice that could cut through the chaos of a training exercise, but for his calculated approach that struck with precision when least expected. Reynolds checked his watch, nearly noon. The men had been at it since dawn, and even he had to admit they were showing remarkable improvement. The crisp December air carried their synchronized footfalls across the grounds as they marched in perfect formation. A hint of pride tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Captain Reynolds." Thomas turned to see Lieutenant Parker approaching, his usual composed demeanor replaced by an urgency that immediately put Reynolds on alert. "Lieutenant, what is it?" "Sir, you need to come to the officers' hall immediately. The radio—" Before Parker could finish, Reynolds noticed other officers rushing toward the main building. Something was happening. Something big. "The men?" Reynolds asked, already knowing the answer. "I'll take over, sir." Reynolds nodded curtly and strode toward the officers' hall. Inside, dozens of men crowded around the large radio in the corner, their faces grim. Colonel Matthews stood at the center, his weathered face ashen as the announcer's voice crackled through the static. "Again, we can confirm that Japanese forces have launched a surprise attack on our naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Early reports indicate significant casualties and damage to our Pacific Fleet. President Roosevelt is expected to address the nation." The room fell into stunned silence as the magnitude of the news settled over them. The United States was at war. After years of watching Europe burn while America stood on the sidelines, they were now thrust into the global conflict. Colonel Matthews turned to the assembled officers, his voice steady despite the shock evident in his eyes. "Gentlemen, I expect we'll receive new orders within hours. Return to your units and prepare them. This changes everything." As the officers dispersed, Matthews caught Reynolds' eye. "Thomas, stay behind." When the room had emptied, Matthews motioned Reynolds to his office. The colonel closed the door and moved to his desk, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses from the bottom drawer. "This isn't regulation, but I think today warrants it." He poured 2 fingers in each glass, sliding one toward Reynolds. Thomas took the glass but didn't drink. "Sir?" Matthews sank heavily into his chair. "Your father served with me in the Great War." "Yes, sir, in the 301st Tank Battalion." "James Reynolds was one of the finest tank commanders I ever knew." Matthews swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "And now it seems history is repeating itself." Reynolds felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders at the mention of his father. Colonel James Reynolds had returned from France a decorated hero, one of the pioneering American tank commanders who had helped break the German lines in the final offensives. The legacy he'd left behind had been Thomas's guiding star and heaviest burden. "I received word last week," Matthews continued. "I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. The Army is accelerating the formation of our armored divisions. The new M4 Sherman tanks are coming off the production lines, and they need experienced officers to command them." Thomas straightened, seeing where this was heading. "You've been selected to command one of the first tank companies equipped with the new Shermans," Matthews said. "Your experience with mechanized cavalry made you a natural choice." Despite the gravity of the day's events, Thomas felt a surge of pride. The Sherman was America's answer to the German panzers, and the opportunity to command some of the first units was an honor few officers would receive. "Thank you, sir. When do I begin?" "Orders will arrive tomorrow, but I can tell you you'll be reporting to the 2nd Armored Division." Matthews took a sip of his whiskey. "You'll be under the command of Colonel William Harrison." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. He worked to keep his expression neutral, but Matthews knew him too well. "I take it you're familiar with Colonel Harrison?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied carefully. "We attended West Point together." Matthews studied him. "There's more to it than that." Thomas hesitated, weighing his words. Professional discretion warred with the truth, but Matthews had been his father's friend. He deserved honesty. "Colonel Harrison and my father had history, sir. They served together in France." "I'm aware." Matthews' expression darkened. "What you may not know is that Harrison has risen quickly through the ranks since then. He has powerful friends in Washington." Thomas finally took a drink of the whiskey, welcoming the burn. "My father never spoke ill of him, even after Harrison took credit for the action at St. Mihiel that your father led," Matthews finished. "James was too honorable to fight for recognition. Harrison wasn't. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. Thomas had pieced together parts of the story over the years from his father's old comrades, but James Reynolds had taken many secrets to his grave. Harrison has been lobbying for command of one of the armored divisions since before the war in Europe began, Matthews continued. He's ambitious, politically connected, and now he's your commanding officer. Thomas set his glass down. My history with Colonel Harrison won't affect my performance, sir. Matthews smiled grimly. That's what concerns me, Thomas. Your performance will be exemplary as always, and that might just make you a target. He finished his drink. Harrison has spent 20 years ensuring no one outshines him. Be careful. Later that evening, Thomas stood alone in his quarters, a photograph of his father in uniform on the desk before him. James Reynolds stood proudly beside one of the French Renault FT tanks they had used in the Great War, so different from the modern machines Thomas would soon command. The radio in the corner delivered updates from Pearl Harbor. The casualty estimates grew with each report. America was at war, and Thomas would follow in his father's footsteps, commanding tanks against the Axis powers. But unlike his father, he would have to watch for enemies on both sides of the battlefield. The next morning, Thomas's orders arrived as Matthews had predicted. He was to report to Camp Gordon to take command of a tank company in the 2nd Armored Division, directly under Colonel William Harrison's command. As he packed his belongings, a knock came at his door. A young private handed him a telegram. Thomas opened it, recognizing his mother's direct style immediately. Your father would be proud. Remember what he taught you about tanks and about men. The former can be replaced, the latter cannot. All my love, mother. Love. Thomas folded the telegram and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. With one last look around the quarters that had been his home for the past year, he picked up his bags and stepped out into a world at war. Chapter 2, Fated Crew. Camp Gordon, Georgia, January 1942. The M4 Sherman tank stood in the center of the training field, its olive drab paint still factory fresh. At 26 tons, the Sherman was a significant improvement over its predecessors, with a 75mm main gun that promised to give American forces the firepower they needed against German armor. Thomas walked slowly around the machine, taking in every detail. This would be his home in combat, his weapon, and potentially his tomb. The thought didn't frighten him as it once might have. Instead, he felt a profound responsibility to the men who would crew this vehicle under his command. She's a beauty, isn't she, Captain? Thomas turned to find a tall, lean man in his early 40s approaching. His uniform was impeccable, but his weathered face and calloused hands spoke of years of practical experience rather than parade ground spit and polish. You must be Sergeant Donovan, Thomas said, extending his hand. Henry Eagle-Eye Donovan shook it firmly. Reporting as ordered, sir. I understand I'll be your gunner. That's right. Thomas studied the man. Donovan's service record was impressive. A veteran of border skirmishes with Pancho Villa's forces in Mexico, he'd been in the Army long enough to have seen the transition from horses to machines. Your marksmanship scores are exceptional. Donovan's expression remained neutral. I hit what I aim at, sir, though I've never fired a 75mm cannon before. Few have, Thomas admitted. That's why we're here. Permission to speak freely, Captain? Thomas nodded, curious. I requested infantry, sir, not tanks. Donovan gazed at the Sherman with undisguised skepticism. I'm not convinced these contraptions are the future of warfare. The honesty was refreshing. Why did you accept the assignment then, Sergeant? Orders are orders, sir, Donovan paused. And I heard you were a straight shooter who takes care of his men. Thomas hadn't expected that. We'll see if I live up to my reputation. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A jeep pulled up beside the tank, and 2 men climbed out. The driver, a stocky Hispanic man with a confident gait, approached and saluted. Corporal Frank Martinez, reporting as ordered, sir. Our driver, Thomas explained to Donovan, returning the salute. Martinez grinned, patting the side of the Sherman. They call me Wrench, Captain. Been fixing and driving everything with an engine since I was 12 in my father's garage in New Mexico. This beauty and I are going to get along just fine. The enthusiasm was contagious, and Thomas found himself warming to the young corporal immediately. The second man hung back, his youthful face betraying his anxiety. And you must be Private O'Brien, Thomas said. The young man stepped forward and offered a somewhat awkward salute. Private Jack O'Brien, sir. They've assigned me as your loader. Jack couldn't have been more than 19, with a fresh face that looked like it had never seen a razor. His slight frame seemed ill-suited to the physical demands of loading shells in the confines of a tank turret. "You're from Iowa, correct?" Thomas asked, recalling the personnel file. "Yes, sir. Cedar Rapids. Never left the state before the Army got me." O'Brien's voice carried a distinct Midwestern accent. "My father was a minister," O'Brien continued, words tumbling out nervously. "He wasn't too happy about me joining up, but after Pearl Harbor, well, seemed like the right thing to do." Thomas nodded, understanding. Thousands of young men had made the same decision after December 7th. "We're still waiting on one more," Thomas said, checking his watch. As if on cue, another Jeep approached, carrying a single passenger. The man who stepped out was of medium build, with thoughtful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He saluted crisply. "Private First Class Robert Miller reporting, sir." "Miller will be our bow gunner," Thomas informed the others. "He was in medical school before he enlisted." Martinez whistled. "A doctor in a tank?" Miller adjusted his glasses self-consciously. "Third year at Johns Hopkins. I figured my skills might be useful, though the recruitment officer seemed to find it amusing." "We call the bow gunner position assistant driver," Thomas explained. "But you'll be responsible for the .30 caliber machine gun in the hull front, and I suspect your medical training will prove valuable." The five men stood in a circle, sizing each other up. They came from different backgrounds, with varying levels of experience and motivation. Thomas knew that molding them into an effective tank crew would be his first and most important challenge. "Gentlemen, this is M4A1 Sherman tank number 3067. Army regulations would have us refer to her by that number, but tradition dictates she needs a proper name." Thomas looked at each man in turn. "Suggestions?" "Thunderbolt," Martinez offered immediately. "Fast and powerful, just like her." "Iron Angel," Miller suggested more quietly. "Protection from above." Donovan shook his head. "Too fancy. Call her Vengeance. That's why we're here, isn't it?" Young O'Brien shifted his weight. "My father would suggest something from Scripture. Sword of Gideon, maybe?" Thomas considered each suggestion, then looked up at the tank that would carry them into battle. "We'll call her Iron Justice, a reminder of why we fight." The men nodded in agreement, and Thomas felt the first bonds of unity forming among them. "Now let's get acquainted with our new home." For the next 3 hours, Thomas led his crew through a detailed exploration of the Sherman systems and capabilities. They practiced entering and exiting the tank, learning the cramped confines that would become familiar territory in the months ahead. Each man familiarized himself with his station, asking questions and absorbing Thomas's instructions. Donovan examined the gunner's position with professional interest, familiarizing himself with the telescopic sight and the controls for the turret and gun. "Elevation is good," he commented, swinging the 75mm gun through its range of motion. "But the turret traverses too slowly. Germans will have their second shot off before we can bring the gun to bear if we miss the first time." Thomas appreciated the veteran's assessment. That's why target identification and first shot accuracy will be critical. The Sherman can't stand toe-to-toe with the heavier German tanks, but it's faster and more reliable. Martinez had disappeared into the driver's compartment and was running his hands over the controls, with the appreciation of a man who understood machinery on an intuitive level. "Radial engine, 9 cylinders, air-cooled," his voice carried up from below. "Nice power-to-weight ratio. She'll do 30 miles per hour on good terrain." Miller and O'Brien were working together to understand the ammunition storage and loading procedures. The young loader was surprisingly quick to grasp the physical routine of moving the heavy shells from the racks to the breech. "The rhythm is important," Thomas explained. "In combat, seconds matter. The faster you can load, the more effective we are." O'Brien nodded earnestly. "I played baseball in school. Coach said I had good hands." "Those hands will save lives now," Thomas told him. As the day progressed, Thomas observed each man's strengths and weaknesses. Donovan was skilled, but rigid, resistant to new ideas. Martinez showed mechanical genius, but might be prone to taking unnecessary risks. Miller was intelligent and detail-oriented, but untested under pressure. And young O'Brien was eager, but inexperienced in every way that mattered. They were imperfect individually, but Thomas saw the potential they had as a crew. With training and trust, they could become an effective fighting unit. Whether they would survive what lay ahead was another question entirely. As the sun began to set, a staff car pulled up to the training area. The men snapped to attention as Colonel William Harrison stepped out. Thomas hadn't seen Harrison in years, but the man was instantly recognizable. Now in his mid-50s, Harrison had the polished appearance of a career officer who had spent more time in headquarters than in the field. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his eyes cold as they settled on Thomas. "Captain Reynolds," Harrison's voice carried across the field. Still playing with tanks, I see, just like your father. Thomas saluted. Colonel Harrison, welcome to our training exercise. Harrison returned the salute with practiced precision. I make it a point to personally inspect at all companies under my command. His gaze swept over the Sherman and the assembled crew, especially those led by the sons of old acquaintances. The emphasis on the word acquaintances wasn't lost on Thomas. Harrison had never acknowledged the true nature of his relationship with James Reynolds, nor the debt he owed him. We're honored by your interest, sir, Thomas replied neutrally. Harrison walked slowly around the tank, occasionally running a gloved finger along the surface as if checking for dust. The Sherman is a remarkable machine, gentlemen. The backbone of our armored forces. He turned to the crew. I expect you to master its operation quickly. We don't have the luxury of extended training periods in wartime. The men are making excellent progress, sir, Thomas assured him. I should hope so. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your first qualification exercise is scheduled for tomorrow morning. A full fire and maneuver drill, evaluated personally by my staff. Thomas maintained his composure, though the announcement was unexpected. Typically, crews had at least a week to familiarize themselves with a new tank before formal evaluation. We'll be ready, sir. See that you are. First impressions matter greatly in my command, Captain Reynolds. Harrison glanced meaningfully at the tank's newly painted name. Iron Justice, is it? Interesting choice. Without waiting for a response, Harrison returned to his staff car. As he opened the door, he paused. Your father had a certain flair for tank operations, Reynolds. Let's hope you've inherited his skill rather than his judgment. The barb was delivered with such casual cruelty that Thomas saw his men exchange glances. As the staff car pulled away, Sergeant Donovan moved to his side. History there, I take it. Thomas watched the dust settle behind Harrison's departing vehicle. You could say that, Sergeant. He's setting us up to fail, Martinez observed bluntly. One day of familiarization before a full evaluation? Then we won't fail, Thomas replied. We'll work through the night if necessary. O'Brien looked nervous but determined. Whatever it takes, sir. Thomas turned to his crew, seeing the questions in their eyes. They deserve some explanation. Colonel Harrison served with my father in the Great War, he said simply. They had different views on leadership and tactics. My father believed in protecting his men. Harrison believed in advancing his career. They clashed. And now he's your commanding officer, Miller observed quietly. And now he's my commanding officer, Thomas confirmed. But that's my problem, not yours. Your only concern is becoming the best tank crew in this division. The men nodded, their resolve visible in their expressions. Sergeant Donovan, start running loading and firing drills with O'Brien. Dry runs only, no live ammunition tonight. Martinez, check every inch of the engine and drivetrain. I want to know this tank's capabilities and limitations before dawn. Miller, familiarize yourself with the bow gun and radio equipment. We'll rotate positions throughout the night so everyone understands each role. As the men moved to their tasks, Thomas climbed up on the turret to study the tactical maps of tomorrow's evaluation course. The Sherman's metal surface was still warm from the day's sun, but a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the evening air. Harrison hadn't just happened by their training session. He had deliberately sought out Thomas to deliver a message. The past was not forgotten, and Thomas would be held to an impossible standard under his command. As darkness fell over Camp Gordon, the sounds of the tank crew working diligently carried across the otherwise quiet training ground. Inside the turret, the repetitive metallic click of O'Brien practicing the loading sequence echoed like a metronome. From the engine compartment came Martinez's occasional comments as he discovered some new aspect of the Sherman's mechanical heart. Thomas watched his men work with growing admiration. They had accepted the unfair challenge without complaint, each focusing on mastering their role. They would need that determination in the days ahead, both for the immediate trial Harrison had set for them and for the greater test that awaited across the ocean. Tomorrow would reveal whether they had the makings of a tank crew that could survive in combat, and whether Thomas had inherited his father's gift for commanding armor in the crucible of war. As midnight approached, a strange noise caught Thomas's attention. From within the tank came an unexpected sound. O'Brien was singing softly as he practiced loading shells into the breech, an old hymn that spoke of strength in adversity. One by one, the other men joined in, their voices blending in the darkness. The simple harmony carried a powerful message. These men might have been strangers that morning, but they were becoming a crew. Harrison had unwittingly accelerated that process with his challenge. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Perhaps the colonel had done them a favor after all. The morning of the evaluation arrived with the first hints of dawn still coloring the eastern sky. Thomas's crew had worked through most of the night, snatching only a few hours of sleep in rotation. Despite their exhaustion, each man moved with purpose as they prepared the tank for inspection. Thomas was conducting a final check when a familiar figure appeared beside him. Colonel Matthews had arrived from Fort Benning, his presence unexpected but welcome. "Colonel," Thomas greeted him with a salute. "I wasn't aware you would be observing today." Matthews returned the salute. "I wasn't planning to, but I received word of Harrison's accelerated evaluation schedule." He lowered his voice. "This isn't standard procedure, Thomas. He's targeting you specifically." "I suspected as much," Thomas admitted. "But we're as ready as we can be." Matthews studied the Sherman and the crew making final preparations. "Harrison has the ear of General Davers. He's positioning himself for division command when we deploy to Europe." He fixed Thomas with a serious gaze. "Be careful today. Harrison is looking for any excuse to relieve you." "Understood, sir." And Thomas, Matthews added, "Whatever happens, remember your father faced similar challenges. He overcame them through skill and integrity." Thomas nodded gratefully as Matthews moved away to join the other observing officers. The colonel's presence provided some reassurance that at least one senior officer would evaluate them fairly. As Thomas rejoined his crew, Martinez approached with a concerned expression. "Captain, there's something you should see." Thomas followed the driver to the engine compartment, where Martinez pointed to a small but crucial component. "The distributor cap has been tampered with," Martinez said quietly. "Someone filed down one of the contact points. It would have caused engine failure during the test." Thomas examined the evidence carefully. The sabotage was subtle enough that it might have been dismissed as mechanical failure, but Martinez's experienced eye had caught it. "Can you repair it?" Martinez nodded. "Already done, sir. I had a replacement in my toolkit." Thomas placed a hand on the driver's shoulder. "Good work, Corporal. Keep this between us for now." Martinez looked troubled. "Sir, someone deliberately tried to sabotage our evaluation." "I'm aware," Thomas replied grimly, "and we'll address that later. For now, we focus on the test." As Thomas walked away, the implications settled heavily on his shoulders. Harrison might dislike him, but would he resort to sabotage? More likely, one of Harrison's loyal subordinates had taken the initiative to please the colonel. Either way, the message was clear. Thomas and his crew had enemies before they had ever faced the Germans. The evaluation began promptly at 0700 hours. Colonel Harrison and his staff observed from a raised platform as Thomas's crew and 5 other tank crews lined up their Shermans at the starting position. The course would test every aspect of tank operation: mobility over varied terrain, accuracy of main gunfire, crew coordination, and tactical decision-making. Harrison's voice carried over the assembled crews through a megaphone. "Gentlemen, this evaluation will determine your readiness for combat deployment. The Axis forces will not be lenient with those who fail to master their equipment, and neither will I." His gaze lingered on Thomas's tank before he continued. "Each crew will navigate the course independently. You will engage multiple targets, both stationary and moving. Points will be deducted from missed targets, excessive time, mechanical failures, and improper tactical decisions." Thomas gathered his crew for final instructions. "Remember your training, trust each other, communicate clearly." He looked each man in the eye. "Donovan, call out targets as you see them. Martinez, smooth operation through the obstacles. Miller, maintain radio contact with command. O'Brien, focus on your loading rhythm." The men nodded, their faces showing fatigue but determination. "One more thing," Thomas added. "Someone may have attempted to sabotage our tank. Stay alert for any unusual performance issues." The revelation drew looks of surprise and anger from the crew. "Who would do that?" O'Brien asked. "That's a question for another time," Thomas replied. "For now, we overcome whatever challenges arise. That's what we'll face in combat." As they took their positions in the Sherman, Thomas felt the familiar calm that always preceded action. Harrison might have stacked the deck against them, but Thomas had absolute faith in the men under his command. They would not fail. Iron Justice roared to life, her engine purring smoothly thanks to Martinez's repairs. Thomas took his position in the turret, standing up with his head out of the commander's hatch to direct the driver. As the signal flare went up, Thomas gave the order. "Driver, advance, standard speed." The Sherman lurched forward, moving toward the first section of the course, a series of obstacles designed to test mobility. Martinez guided the tank with surprising finesse, navigating ditches and berms with minimal loss of speed. "First target, 2 o'clock, range 800 yards. Thomas called out, spotting a plywood silhouette of a German Panzer IV. Donovan swung the turret smoothly, acquiring the target through his sight. Target identified. Gunner, armor-piercing, target tank. Armor-piercing loaded, O'Brien confirmed, his voice steady despite the tank's rocking motion. Fire when ready. Donovan adjusted the elevation slightly to compensate for distance, then pressed the firing pedal. The Sherman rocked with the recoil of the 75mm gun. Through his binoculars, Thomas watched as the shell struck the target dead center. Target destroyed, he announced. Good shooting. They progressed through the course efficiently, engaging targets and navigating obstacles. Thomas noted with satisfaction that his crew was performing as if they had worked together for months rather than a single day. Even Donovan, initially skeptical of the tank's capabilities, was demonstrating exceptional skill with the main gun. Then came the unexpected challenge. As they approached a wooded area, a series of smoke grenades detonated, obscuring their vision completely. This hadn't been in the course description. "Driver, halt," Thomas ordered. The standard procedure would be to wait for the smoke to clear or bypass the area entirely. But Thomas suspected this was Harrison's addition to test his decision-making. "Miller, radio command for instructions regarding the smoke obstacle." After a moment on the radio, Miller looked up. "Command says to proceed through the smoke, sir. Multiple targets within." Thomas weighed his options quickly. Proceeding blind into an area with targets was tactically unsound. In real combat, it would be suicidal, but this was a test, and Harrison was watching. Thomas made his decision based not on what would please Harrison, but on what would be right in actual combat. "Driver, reverse. Take us around the left flank of the smoke." Martinez complied immediately, backing the Sherman up and then turning to circumvent the smoke cloud. Thomas knew his decision would cost them points on the evaluation, but it was the correct tactical choice. As they rounded the smoke, they had a clear view of the ambush that had been set up within. 3 target tanks positioned to fire on any vehicle entering the smoke directly. From their new position on the flank, Thomas's crew had an ideal firing angle. "Gunner, multiple targets, left to right sequence." Donovan responded with precision, swinging the turret to engage each target in turn. O'Brien loaded with remarkable speed, and Miller provided accurate ranging information from his position. Within 30 seconds, all 3 targets had been hit. As they completed the remainder of the course, Thomas knew they had performed exceptionally well despite Harrison's attempts to undermine them. The crew's natural talents had meshed with Thomas's leadership to overcome both the standard challenges and the unexpected obstacles. When they returned to the starting area, Colonel Matthews was waiting, a rare smile on his weathered face. "Impressive performance, Captain, especially your decision at the smokescreen." "Thank you, sir," Thomas replied. "That was a crew effort." "Indeed." Matthews glanced toward the observation platform, where Harrison stood in conversation with his staff. "Colonel Harrison seems less enthused about your tactical choice to flank the smoke." "It was the correct decision in combat conditions, sir." "I agree," Matthews lowered his voice. "And so would your father." As the evaluation results were compiled, Thomas gathered his exhausted crew. "Regardless of the official outcome, you men performed admirably today. I couldn't have asked for better execution under the circumstances." Donovan, usually stoic, allowed himself a slight smile. "We made a decent showing, Captain." "Decent?" Martinez exclaimed. "We were magnificent. Did you see how I took that last berm?" O'Brien's youthful face showed relief and pride. "And we never missed a shot." "Captain," Miller interjected quietly, "Colonel Harrison is approaching." Thomas turned to see Harrison striding toward them, his expression unreadable. The crew fell silent as he stopped before them. "Captain Reynolds," Harrison began formally, "your crew completed the course 3 minutes faster than any other team, with perfect target acquisition." Thomas acknowledged the statement with a nod, waiting for the inevitable criticism. "However," Harrison continued, "your decision to disobey direct orders regarding the smokescreen obstacle shows a disturbing lack of discipline. Sir, with respect, my tactical decision was based on standard combat doctrine." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to follow orders, Captain, not interpret them based on your personal judgment." He glanced at the other officers nearby, including Matthews. "Nevertheless, your overall performance was adequate. You'll remain in command of this tank for now." The qualification was clear. For now. Harrison wasn't finished testing Thomas. As Harrison walked away, Sergeant Donovan moved to Thomas's side. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Always, Sergeant. That man has it out for you, and by extension, for us." Donovan's expression was grim. In my experience, officers with vendettas are dangerous, especially to those under their command. Thomas understood Donovan's concern. The veteran NCO had likely seen good men die because of poor leadership. I'm aware of the risks, Sergeant, but I won't let Harrison's vendetta affect our preparation for combat. And what happens when we're in combat, sir? Martinez asked. Will he send us on suicide missions to settle his score with you? The question hung in the air, uncomfortably close to Thomas's own concerns. Our job is to be the best tank crew we can be, Thomas finally replied. Everything else is beyond our control. He looked at each of his men. But I promise you this, I will never sacrifice your lives for my advancement or allow anyone else to do so. If that means standing up to Harrison, so be it. The declaration seemed to satisfy the crew. They dispersed to secure the tank, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. As the sun set over Camp Gordon, Thomas found himself standing beside Iron Justice, his hand resting on her armored flank. The tank was cooling after the day's exertions, the metal contracting with occasional pings and creaks. From his pocket, Thomas withdrew a small object, his father's compass, carried throughout the campaigns in France. The tarnished brass case bore a small dent where it had deflected a piece of shrapnel, saving James Reynolds' life in the process. Thomas opened it, watching the needle swing steadily north despite the presence of the massive steel tank beside him. His father had given him the compass on his 18th birthday with simple advice. No matter how confused the battlefield becomes, this will always show you the way home. Now, facing an uncertain future under Harrison's command, Thomas needed that guidance more than ever. His crew was counting on him, not just to lead them in battle, but to protect them from the politics and vendettas that could prove just as deadly. As darkness fell, Thomas made a silent promise to his crew, to his father's memory, and to himself. He would navigate them through whatever challenges lay ahead, both from the enemy and from within their own ranks, and he would bring them home. With that resolution firm in his mind, Thomas pocketed the compass and walked toward his quarters. Tomorrow would bring new training, new challenges, and perhaps new threats from Harrison. But for tonight, he had found his bearing. Chapter 3, Past and Present. The officers' club at Camp Gordon hummed with conversation and cigarette smoke, a rare evening of relaxation before the intensified training schedule began. Thomas sat alone at a corner table reviewing maintenance reports on the Shermans assigned to his company. The evaluation had revealed minor issues in several tanks that needed addressing before they could be certified combat ready. Captain Reynolds. Thomas looked up to find a man he didn't recognize standing beside his table. The major's insignia on his collar caught the light. Major Wilson, Intelligence Division, the man introduced himself. Mind if I join you? Thomas gestured to the empty chair. Please. Wilson sat, placing his drink on the table. He was perhaps 40, with observant eyes that seemed to catalog everything about Thomas in a single glance. Your crew performed admirably in yesterday's evaluation, Wilson remarked, particularly your decision to flank the smokescreen rather than charge through it. Thank you, sir. Though Colonel Harrison had a different assessment. Wilson's smile was knowing. Harrison believes in following orders to the letter, regardless of tactical soundness. He took a sip of his drink. Your father had a similar reputation for independent thinking, as I recall. Thomas studied the major with new interest. You knew my father? I studied his tactics at the Command and General Staff College. His actions at St. Mihiel are considered textbook examples of armored breakthrough operations. Wilson leaned forward slightly, though the official records credit Colonel Harrison with leading that action. The statement hung between them, an invitation for Thomas to comment on the historical inaccuracy. Instead, he asked, "Is there something I can help you with, Major?" Wilson nodded, appreciating Thomas's discretion. I'm conducting a security review of personnel in the armored divisions, particularly those with access to the technical specifications of the Sherman. There have been concerns about information security. You suspect leaks? I suspect many things, Captain. Wilson's voice dropped, including the possibility that certain officers may have conflicts of interest with defense contractors. Thomas set down his pencil. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation yet, merely an investigation. Wilson studied Thomas carefully. Your father kept journals of his time in France, didn't he? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Yes, but I don't see how that's relevant. Would you be willing to let me review them? They might contain contextual information that would be valuable to my investigation. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness. His father's journals were private, filled with personal reflections as well as military observations. May I ask why you're interested in 25-year-old journals? Historical patterns, Captain. Wilson finished his drink. Sometimes the past illuminates the present. He stood, placing a card on the table. Think about it. You can reach me at this number. As Wilson walked away, Thomas pocketed the card, troubled by the conversation. The Major's interest in his father's journals seemed oddly specific, and the vague references to security concerns and defense contractors left more questions than answers. Thomas returned to his quarters that night to find a package waiting for him. The return address showed his mother's elegant handwriting. Inside was a leather-bound book Thomas recognized immediately. One of his father's wartime journals, along with a brief note. Thomas, I believe you'll need this now. Your father would want you to have it. There are things he never told you that you should know. Trust your instincts, as he did. With love, Mother. Thomas ran his hand over the worn leather cover. He had read portions of his father's journals years ago, but his mother had kept some volumes private, saying they contained information James had wanted withheld until the right time. Opening to the first page, Thomas found an inscription in his father's bold handwriting. The truth must survive even when men do not. For the next several hours, Thomas read by lamplight, absorbing his father's account of the final months of the Great War. The journal detailed the operations of the 301st Tank Battalion as they supported infantry advances against German positions. James Reynolds' writing was clear and precise, recording both tactical observations and personal reflections. Then Thomas reached the entries concerning the St. Mihiel offensive in September 1918. What he read made his blood run cold. According to his father's detailed account, Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison had deliberately altered the attack plan at the last minute, sending tanks into an area with known German anti-tank positions. The result had been the loss of several tanks and crews. When Captain James Reynolds had confronted Harrison about the decision, Harrison had threatened him with court-martial for insubordination. The most damning revelation came in the entry dated September 16, 1918. Today I discovered the reason for H's inexplicable tactical decisions. Among papers in his quarters was correspondence with representatives of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation discussing performance data from our engagements. H has been deliberately testing the vulnerability of our tanks against German weapons to gather data for future tank designs, using our men as unwitting test subjects. When I confronted him with this evidence, he reminded me that his family's connections in Washington would ensure any accusations I made would be dismissed. He then offered me promotion and recognition if I would support his research. I refused. I fear this decision will cost me my career, but I cannot be party to the deliberate sacrifice of my men for corporate interests. Thomas sat back, stunned by the revelation. His father had discovered Harrison engaging in what amounted to corporate espionage in the callous endangerment of American troops for private profit. More disturbing still was the implication that Harrison had powerful protection in Washington that had shielded him from consequences. The final pages of the journal contain James Reynolds' growing certainty that Harrison was behind a campaign to discredit him, culminating in Harrison taking credit for the successful tactics James had developed at St. Mihiel. Thomas closed the journal, his mind racing. If Harrison had been willing to sacrifice American lives for corporate interests in the last war, what might he be capable of now, with far more powerful tanks under his command and a global conflict providing cover for his actions? Major Wilson's interest in the journal suddenly made more sense. The intelligence officer must have suspected a connection between Harrison's past activities and current security concerns. Thomas locked the journal in his footlocker, unsure of his next move. Accusing a superior officer of treason based on a 25-year-old journal would be career suicide without substantial supporting evidence. Yet the pattern Wilson had hinted at suggested Harrison might still be engaged in similar activities. The next morning, Thomas was summoned to Colonel Harrison's office. The colonel sat behind a large desk reviewing documents. He didn't look up when Thomas entered and saluted. "Captain Reynolds," Harrison said finally, setting aside his papers, "I've been examining your crew's performance data from the evaluation." "Yes, sir." "Your gunner, Sergeant Donovan, achieved impressive accuracy." Harrison's tone was conversational, but Thomas remained alert. "And your loader, Private O'Brien, demonstrated exceptional speed for a novice." "They're good men, sir." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with cold eyes. "I've decided to assign your tank crew to a special project, a series of tests to evaluate potential modifications to the Sherman's armor and armament. Thomas felt a chill of recognition. The scenario was eerily similar to what his father had described in his journal. What kind of tests, sir? Live fire exercises against captured German anti-tank weapons, Harrison explained. We need to understand the Sherman's vulnerabilities before we face them in combat. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Thomas now viewed Harrison's motives with deep suspicion. Will other crews be participating in these tests? Eventually, your crew will conduct the initial trials. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Consider it recognition of your exceptional performance. Thomas chose his next words carefully. I'm concerned about the risks involved, sir. Live fire testing against actual anti-tank weapons could endanger my crew. Harrison's expression hardened. Are you questioning orders, Captain? I'm requesting clarification on safety protocols, sir. The tests will have all necessary safety measures, Harrison replied dismissively. Representatives from our industrial partners will be present to observe and gather data. The mention of industrial partners confirmed Thomas's suspicions. Harrison was continuing his old practices, using American tanks and crews to gather data for defense contractors. I'll need to brief my crew thoroughly before these tests begin, Thomas said. Of course. Harrison stood, indicating the meeting was over. The first test is scheduled for next week. I suggest you use the time to ensure your crew is prepared. As Thomas saluted and turned to leave, Harrison added, Oh, and Captain, I understand you've recently received some personal effects from home. Family heirlooms can be so illuminating. I hope you're finding them educational. The thinly veiled reference to his father's journal stopped Thomas in his tracks. Either Harrison had spies monitoring his mail, or he had sources close to Thomas's mother. Either way, the threat was clear. Harrison knew about the journal and was warning Thomas to keep its contents to himself. Yes, sir, very educational. That evening, Thomas met with his crew behind the maintenance shed where they could speak privately. He had decided that they deserved to know what they were facing, both from the Germans and from within their own command. Gentlemen, I've called you here because we're being assigned to a special testing program, Thomas began. Colonel Harrison wants us to participate in live fire exercises against German anti-tank weapons. Martinez whistled. They're going to shoot at us with actual German guns? That sounds more like execution than training. The colonel assures me there will be safety protocols in place, Thomas replied, his tone making it clear how much faith he put in those assurances. Donovan's eyes narrowed. But you don't believe him? Thomas hesitated, then made his decision. I have reason to believe that Colonel Harrison may be using these tests for purposes beyond standard military evaluation. What kind of purposes? Miller asked. Industrial espionage, Thomas said bluntly, gathering performance data for private companies at the expense of regular Army personnel. The men exchanged glances, absorbing the implication. That would be treason, Donovan said quietly. It would, Thomas agreed, but proving it would be nearly impossible, especially given Harrison's connections in Washington. So what do we do, Captain? O'Brien asked, his young face troubled. Thomas looked at each man in turn. I won't order any of you to participate in these tests. If you want transfers to other units, I'll approve them without question. The crew was silent for a long moment. Then Donovan spoke. With respect, sir, that's not happening. This crew stays together. Martinez nodded firmly. If Harrison is putting tankers at risk for personal gain, someone needs to stop him. Might as well be us. Miller adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. We'll need evidence if we're going to expose him. Concrete proof of his activities. And we'll need to survive his tests to gather that evidence, Thomas pointed out. O'Brien, the youngest and most vulnerable, straightened his shoulders. My father always says evil thrives when good men do nothing. I'm staying with the crew, sir. Thomas felt a surge of pride in these men who had been strangers just days ago. Then we go forward together. We'll participate in Harrison's tests, but we'll be gathering our own data. Miller, your scientific background will be valuable here. Document everything, especially any unusual requests or procedures. Yes, sir. In the meantime, Thomas continued, I'm going to explore another avenue of investigation. There's someone who might be able to help us understand what we're facing. Later that night, Thomas placed a call to the number Major Wilson had provided. The intelligence officer agreed to meet him off base the following evening. They met at a small diner in the nearby town, away from military eyes. Thomas brought his father's journal, though he was reluctant to surrender it completely. Your father was a perceptive man, Wilson said after Thomas had summarized the journal's contents. And braver than most, confronting Harrison was a significant risk. He paid for it with his career, Thomas noted. Harrison used his connections to ensure my father never rose above colonel, despite his combat record. Wilson nodded. Harrison's family has deep ties to the armaments industry. His uncle was a founding partner in what is now Allied Defense Systems, one of the largest tank manufacturers in the country. And now Harrison is running tests that involve shooting at Shermans with German weapons, Thomas said, with my crew inside. It's consistent with his pattern, Wilson agreed, but proving his activities are improper is challenging. On paper, these tests have legitimate military value. But you suspect otherwise. Wilson studied Thomas carefully before responding. We've intercepted communications suggesting that technical specifications for American armored vehicles are being shared with unauthorized parties. The leaks appear to originate from officers with access to performance data. Like data from live fire tests, Thomas suggested. Precisely. Wilson leaned forward. Captain, I believe Harrison is continuing the same activities your father discovered, but on a larger scale. He's using his position to gather proprietary information for Allied defense systems, potentially compromising our tactical advantages. Why would he risk it? Harrison already has wealth and position. Some men are never satisfied, Wilson replied. Allied defense is competing for contracts worth millions. Data showing their designs perform better than competitors could be worth the risk. Thomas considered the implications. What do you need from me? Continue with the testing program. Document everything, especially any irregularities in procedures or data collection. And watch for individuals who don't belong with standard military test observers. Civilian contractors, Thomas surmised. Exactly. Wilson stood to leave, placing a small camera on the table. Use this if you can do so safely. Photographic evidence would be invaluable. As Wilson departed, Thomas remained at the table, contemplating the dangerous game he was entering. His father had stood alone against Harrison and paid the price. Thomas had the advantage of foreknowledge and potential allies in Wilson and his crew, but the risks were still enormous. The following week, as Thomas prepared his crew for the first test, he received an unexpected visitor. A young lieutenant from division headquarters delivered a sealed envelope marked personal and confidential. Inside was a brief note in an unfamiliar hand. Captain Reynolds, your father saved my life at St. Mihiel when our tank was hit. I've never forgotten his courage or his integrity. Be careful with Harrison. He destroyed many good officers who questioned his methods. There are those of us still serving who remember the truth. You are not alone. A friend. The note was unsigned, but it reinforced what Thomas already knew. Harrison had enemies as well as allies. The challenge would be identifying which was which before it was too late. As Thomas watched his crew make final preparations on Iron Justice for the upcoming tests, he felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever. They were facing dangers from both the simulated enemy and their own chain of command. Donovan approached, his weathered face serious. All systems checked and ready, sir. Whatever they throw at us, we'll be as prepared as possible. Thomas nodded, grateful for the veteran's steadiness. Thank you, Sergeant. Let's hope it's enough. Permission to speak freely, Captain? Always. Donovan glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. I served under your father briefly in 18. He was a good officer who put his men first. The sergeant's eyes hardened. Men like that are rare, worth following, worth fighting for. The unexpected connection to his father left Thomas momentarily speechless. You never mentioned that before. Wasn't relevant until now. Donovan held Thomas's gaze. Your father stood against Harrison alone. You won't have to. With that simple declaration of loyalty, Donovan returned to his duties, leaving Thomas with a renewed sense of purpose. His father had fought this battle before and lost, but had planted seeds of resistance that lived on in men like Donovan. Thomas turned his eyes to the horizon where storm clouds were gathering, a fitting metaphor for what lay ahead. The Sherman tank beside him represented America's industrial might and the hope of victory against tyranny abroad. But first, Thomas and his crew would have to win a more subtle battle against corruption at home. As lightning flashed in the distance, Thomas made a silent vow. He would succeed where his father had been forced to retreat. He would protect his men and expose Harrison's treachery, whatever the personal cost. This time, justice would prevail. The storm was coming, both figuratively and literally, and Iron Justice would face it head-on. Camp Gordon, Georgia, February 1942. Dawn broke over the test range, the rising sun illuminating a scene unlike any Thomas had witnessed before. A collection of captured German weapons had been arranged at varying distances from the course their Sherman would travel. The centerpiece was a formidable 88mm anti-tank gun, its long barrel gleaming in the morning light. The weapon had gained a fearsome reputation among Allied forces in North Africa, capable of punching through a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding a mile. Jesus, Martinez whispered as they surveyed the course from their vantage point on a nearby hill. That's not testing. That's a firing squad. Thomas shared his driver's concern, though he kept his expression neutral. The 88 mm gun alone posed a serious threat, even in a controlled test environment. Added to it were several smaller caliber anti-tank guns and what appeared to be a captured German Panzer III tank, positioned to observe from a safe distance. "Miller, what do you make of the setup?" Thomas asked. The former medical student adjusted his glasses, studying the range with clinical detachment. "The weapons are arranged to test different impact angles on our armor. They've positioned cameras and measurement equipment at strategic points." He pointed to a small group of men in civilian clothing, examining instruments near the German 88. "Those aren't regular Army personnel." "The industrial partners Harrison mentioned," Thomas concluded. Donovan grunted. "Allied Defense Systems representatives, most likely. Come to see how their product holds up." The veteran gunner's voice dripped with disgust. "Or how it doesn't." O'Brien looked pale, his youthful face showing the fear he was trying to suppress. "Sir, are they really going to fire that 88 at us?" "Not directly," Thomas assured him. "According to the test parameters, all shots will be aimed to miss by predetermined margins. We'll be measuring the effects of near impacts and shell fragmentation." The young loader didn't look convinced. "And we're trusting the Germans design their guns with built-in margins of error?" The question hung in the air, unnerving in its simplicity. Thomas had no comforting answer. Instead, he gathered his crew closer, keeping his voice low. "Listen carefully. The test protocol calls for us to follow a marked course at a steady 15 miles per hour. Each weapon will fire as we pass its designated zone. We maintain course and speed regardless of impacts." Thomas met each man's eyes in turn. "Harrison wants data, and we're going to give it to him, but we're also going to gather our own evidence." Thomas removed the small camera Major Wilson had provided. "Miller, you'll document everything from your position. Focus on the civilians and any unusual interactions between them and military personnel." The bowgunner nodded, accepting the camera and concealing it in his jacket. "Martinez, how's our engine modification?" The driver grinned. "Ready to go, Captain. I've adjusted the governor to give us an extra burst of speed if needed. Won't last long, but it could make the difference between a near miss and a direct hit if things go south." "Good man." Thomas turned to Donovan and O'Brien. "Keep the gun loaded with high explosive. Official protocol says our weapon should remain unloaded, but I want options if we need them." Donovan raised an eyebrow but nodded his approval. O'Brien looked slightly more confident, knowing they wouldn't be entirely defenseless. "One more thing," Thomas added. "If I give the order to abandon the test, Martinez will execute an immediate smoke screen and hard turn to the east. We make for the tree line and don't stop until we reach the secondary assembly area. Is that clear?" "Crystal, sir," Martinez replied for all of them. As they prepared to board Iron Justice, Colonel Harrison's staff car pulled up to the observation post. Harrison stepped out, accompanied by a civilian in an expensive suit. The colonel spotted Thomas and approached, the civilian following a step behind. "Captain Reynolds," Harrison's voice carried the false warmth he reserved for public interactions. "I trust your crew is prepared for today's test?" "Yes, sir. We've reviewed the protocols and are ready to proceed." Harrison gestured to the well-dressed man beside him. "This is Mr. Lawrence Whitfield, Executive Vice President of Allied Defense Systems. He's here to observe our evaluation of the Sherman's performance against captured enemy weapons." Whitfield extended his hand, which Thomas shook with professional courtesy. The executive was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to power and deference. "Captain Reynolds," Whitfield said smoothly, "Colonel Harrison speaks highly of your abilities. It's brave men like you who provide the data we need to improve our vehicles and save American lives." The practiced speech might have seemed genuine if Thomas hadn't known the company's true intentions. He wondered how many other tank crews had heard similar platitudes before being sent into dangerous tests for corporate profit. "We're honored to serve, sir," Thomas replied neutrally. Whitfield smiled, apparently satisfied with Thomas's response. "Harrison tells me your father was in tanks during the Great War. The Reynolds name has a distinguished history with armored warfare." The casual reference to his father set off warning bells in Thomas's mind. Was this a coincidence, or did Whitfield know about James Reynolds' conflict with Harrison? Thomas kept his expression carefully composed. "My father served with the 3 1st Tank Battalion, yes." "Ah, yes, Saint Mihiel and the Meuse Argonne. Whitfield nodded as if sharing fond memories. Different machines back then, of course. Much has changed in tank design. Today's tests will help us understand how our current models measure up against the most advanced German weapons. Harrison cleared his throat. We should proceed to the observation post, Lawrence. Captain, you'll find the test course marked with the white flags. Maintain 15 miles per hour and follow the route precisely. Radio confirmation at each checkpoint. Understood, sir. As Harrison and Whitfield walked away, Thomas heard the executive ask, "You're certain this crew can follow instructions exactly, William? The data points are critical." "Reynolds will perform as required," Harrison assured him, "one way or another." The ominous note in Harrison's voice confirmed Thomas's suspicions. This test was designed to gather specific data, regardless of the risk to the crew. Thomas turned to his men. "Mount up. Let's show them what iron justice can do." Inside the Sherman, each man took his position with practiced efficiency. The cramped interior, once unfamiliar, had become a second home after weeks of training. Martinez started the engine, its powerful rumble vibrating through the steel hull. Miller took his place at the bow gun, the camera concealed but ready. Donovan settled into the gunner's seat, his experienced hands resting lightly on the controls. O'Brien positioned himself as loader, a shell already prepared despite protocol stating otherwise. Thomas stood in the commander's position, head out of the turret hatch to direct their movement. The morning air was cool against his face, carrying the scent of diesel and gun oil. "All stations report," Thomas ordered. "Driver ready. Gunner ready. Loader ready. Bow gunner ready. Iron Justice moving out," Thomas reported into the radio, proceeding to start point. Martinez guided the Sherman down from their position and onto the test range. The white flags marking their course stretched ahead in a winding path that would take them past each of the German weapons at different angles and distances. Thomas noted with concern that the course brought them closer to the 88mm gun than he would have preferred. "Start point reached," Thomas reported. "Beginning test run." "Confirmed," came Harrison's voice over the radio. "Proceed at test speed. First firing position in 30 seconds. Martinez accelerated smoothly to 15 miles per hour, maintaining the exact speed with professional precision. The Sherman moved steadily along the marked route, its tracks kicking up dust from the dry ground. Thomas watched the first weapon position approach. A German 50mm anti-tank gun, manned by American crews in this test, tracked their movement. "First position, 10 seconds, Thomas informed his crew. "Brace for nearby impact." The gun fired with a sharp crack, the shell whistling overhead and exploding 30 yards behind them. Close enough to be unsettling, but not a direct threat. "First position, clear," Thomas reported, proceeding to second position. The next two weapon positions delivered similar results, their shells landing at calculated distances from the Sherman. Thomas began to hope that the test might proceed according to the established safety protocols after all. Then they approached the 88mm gun. Thomas noticed immediately that something was different. The gun crew was making adjustments that hadn't been part of the briefing. The massive weapons barrel tracked them with ominous precision rather than maintaining the fixed positions specified in the test parameters. "Martinez, prepare for evasive maneuvers," Thomas said quietly, not using the radio. "Something's wrong with the 88 position." "Ready, sir," the driver responded, his hand moving to the modified throttle control. Thomas scanned the observation post and spotted Harrison in animated conversation with Whitfield. The executive was pointing at their tank and gesturing to a clipboard held by another civilian. 88 position in 15 seconds, Thomas announced to his crew. "Stay alert." As they entered the weapons firing zone, Thomas saw the gun crew make a final adjustment. The barrel lowered fractionally, now aimed directly at their path rather than to the side as specified. "Martinez, now!" Thomas shouted. The driver slammed the modified throttle forward. Iron Justice lurched as the engine roared with unexpected power, surging ahead at nearly twice the test speed. Simultaneously, Thomas dropped down into the turret and sealed the hatch. The 88mm gun fired with a thunderous boom. The shell passed through the space where they would have been at the prescribed speed, missing them by mere yards. The shockwave rocked the Sherman, but they continued forward, accelerating beyond the marked course. "Deploy smoke," Thomas ordered. Martinez hit the smoke generator controls. Thick white smoke billowed from the rear of the tank, obscuring them from the observation post view. "Sir, they're ordering us to return to course," Miller reported, monitoring the radio. "Maintain current heading and speed," Thomas replied firmly. "We're aborting the test." The Sherman charged toward the tree line at the eastern edge of the range. soon disappearing into the forest protective cover. Only when they were well concealed did Thomas order Martinez to reduce speed and find a defensible position. "Everyone all right?" Thomas asked as the tank came to a halt in a small clearing. Affirmative responses came from each position, though O'Brien's voice shook slightly. "That was no test," Donovan stated flatly. "That 88 was aimed to hit us." "Miller, did you get photographs?" Thomas asked. "Yes, sir. Several of the civilian observers and the gun crew making unauthorized adjustments." Thomas nodded grimly. "Good. Harrison will claim it was a mistake in calculation or crew error, but the photos should prove otherwise." "What now, Captain?" Martinez asked. "They'll be looking for us." "Now we wait," Thomas replied. "If Harrison wants his precious data, he'll have to explain why the 88 was aimed directly at us instead of following the test parameters." For nearly an hour, they remained in position, listening to increasingly urgent radio calls ordering them to return. Thomas maintained radio silence, letting Harrison stew in uncertainty. Finally, a new voice came over the radio. "Iron Justice, this is Colonel Matthews. Do you copy? Your status is requested." Thomas exchanged glances with Miller, then responded. "Colonel Matthews, this is Captain Reynolds. We are intact and in secure position. We aborted the test due to safety concerns." "Understood, Captain. What is the nature of your concerns?" "The 88 made him a position deviated from test parameters, sir. The weapon was aimed directly at our vehicle rather than at the prescribed offset. We took evasive action to avoid a direct hit." There was a pause before Matthews responded. "Return to base, Captain. Different route from the test course. I'll meet you at the maintenance shed." "Acknowledged, sir. Returning to base." As Martinez guided the Sherman through the forest and back toward Camp Gordon by a circuitous route, Thomas considered their next move. The test had clearly been designed to gather data on a direct hit, not the near misses specified in the protocol. Harrison and Whitfield had been willing to risk a tank crew for their data. The question was whether Matthews would stand with them against Harrison's influence, or whether the powerful colonel had already crafted a narrative that would shield him from any consequences. When they arrived at the maintenance shed, Matthews was waiting alone, his staff car parked discreetly to one side. The colonel's weathered face showed concern as the crew dismounted. "Inside," Matthews directed, gesturing to the shed. "Harrison is searching the East Range for you." Once they were all inside the relative privacy of the maintenance shed, Matthews turned to Thomas. "Tell me exactly what happened." Thomas gave a detailed account of the test and the 88's suspicious adjustment. "Miller has photographic evidence, sir." Matthews nodded to the bow gunner, who produced the camera and handed it over. "I'll have these developed immediately through secure channels," Matthews promised. "In the meantime, you five need to prepare for the storm that's coming." "Sir?" Thomas questioned. "Harrison is claiming you panicked and abandoned the test without cause," Matthews explained. "He's demanding disciplinary action for endangering expensive equipment and disobeying direct orders." "That's ridiculous," Martinez protested. "They tried to kill us." Matthews held up a hand. "I believe you. But Harrison has Whitfield backing his story, along with several officers who owe him their careers." The colonel looked grim. "This isn't just about today's test, Reynolds. Something bigger is happening here." Thomas shared a glance with his crew before responding. "We know, sir, industrial espionage. Harrison is selling test data to Allied defense systems for their exclusive use." Matthew's eyebrows rose. "You have evidence of this?" "Circumstantial but compelling. My father documented similar activities by Harrison during the Great War." Thomas hesitated, then added, "Major Wilson from Intelligence is also investigating the connection." "Wilson," Matthews repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that makes sense now. He's been asking questions about Harrison for months." The colonel straightened. "I need to make some calls. You men lay low until I return. No radio contact, no reports." After Matthews departed, the crew gathered around the small stove in the corner of the maintenance shed. The February chill, more noticeable now that the adrenaline of their escape was fading. "Think Matthews will back us?" Martinez asked, warming his hands over the stove. Donovan shrugged. "Depends on how much political capital he's willing to spend. Harrison has powerful friends." "He tried to kill us," O'Brien said, still processing the reality of what had happened. "An American officer deliberately tried to kill American soldiers. For data," Miller added quietly. "Our lives in exchange for performance statistics on a direct 88mm hit." Thomas listened to his men, their loyalty to each other now cemented by shared danger. They had trusted him to lead them safely through the test, and he had succeeded, at least for today. But Harrison wouldn't stop with one failed attempt, especially now that Thomas had openly defied him. "Whatever happens next," Thomas told them, "we stay together." Harrison may have the advantage of rank and connections, but we have the truth, and eventually the truth finds its way into the light. The shed door opened, and they all turned, tense and ready. It was Matthews, his expression grave. "Captain, I've spoken with General Devers. He's ordered a formal investigation into today's incident." Matthews handed Thomas a sealed envelope. "These are your new orders. Effective immediately, your crew is being temporarily reassigned to specialized training at Fort Knox. You leave tonight." Thomas accepted the orders with surprise. "Sir? It's not ideal, but it gets you away from Harrison while the investigation proceeds," Matthews explained. "I had to call in several favors to make this happen." "Thank you, sir," Thomas said sincerely. Matthews lowered his voice. "This isn't over, Reynolds. Harrison is furious, and Whitfield is demanding access to your crew for debriefing. The reassignment buys us time, but Harrison will find a way to strike back." "We understand the risk, sir." "Good." Matthews straightened. "A transport will be ready at 2200 hours. Pack only essentials. Your tank has already been secured for transport." As Matthews turned to leave, Thomas asked the question that had been troubling him. "Sir, why are you helping us? You're risking your career opposing Harrison." The colonel paused at the door. "Because 25 years ago, I watched a good man's career destroyed for doing the right thing. I didn't stand with James Reynolds then, and I've regretted it ever since." His eyes met Thomas's. "I won't make the same mistake twice." With those words, Matthews departed, leaving Thomas with a new understanding of the complex web of loyalties and old debts that surrounded his father's history with Harrison. More importantly, they now had at least one high-ranking ally in their corner. That night, under cover of darkness, Thomas and his crew slipped away from Camp Gordon. Iron Justice was loaded onto a flatbed transport, covered with tarps to conceal its identity. The men traveled in a separate truck, maintaining silence until they were well clear of the base. As the lights of Camp Gordon faded behind them, Thomas felt both relief and apprehension. They had escaped Harrison's immediate reach, but the colonel's influence extended far beyond Georgia. The battle was just beginning, and Fort Knox might provide only temporary sanctuary. O'Brien voiced what they were all thinking. "He'll find us again, won't he, Captain?" Thomas nodded, watching the darkened landscape pass by. "Yes, he will. And next time, we'll be ready." Chapter 5, Forged in Combat. Fort Knox, Kentucky, March 1942. The massive training facility sprawled across the Kentucky countryside, its grounds filled with tanks and armored vehicles in various stages of assembly and modification. Fort Knox served as the heart of America's armored warfare program, where tactics were developed, crews trained, and new vehicles tested under the watchful eyes of the Army's top experts. For Thomas and his crew, the past 3 weeks had provided both respite and challenge. Away from Harrison's direct authority, they had immersed themselves in advanced tank warfare training, learning tactics developed from the hard lessons of the European battlefields. "Gentlemen, gather round," Colonel James Adler called to the assembled tank commanders. A lean, energetic officer in his 50s, Adler had fought with Patton in the First World War and now served as the chief instructor for armored combat tactics. "Today's exercise will simulate conditions reported by our British allies facing Rommel in North Africa." Thomas joined the other captains clustered around the sand table in the briefing room. The detailed model showed a desert landscape with ridges, wadis, and carefully positioned German and American tank formations. "The Africa Corps has demonstrated superior tactical coordination between their armor, anti-tank guns, and air support," Adler continued, using a pointer to indicate positions on the table. "They're particularly adept at setting up kill zones where multiple anti-tank guns can engage our armor from concealed positions." Thomas studied the sand table intently. The scenario reminded him uncomfortably of the test Harrison had arranged, though this time the purpose was legitimate training rather than corporate data gathering. Reynolds, Adler called, "Your crew performed exceptionally well in yesterday's maneuver exercise. Today you'll lead Blue Force against Red Force, Commander Captain Westbrook. 7 tanks each, standard crew complement." Thomas nodded his acknowledgement, glancing across the table at Westbrook, a capable officer who had served briefly in the Philippines before the war. The other captain smiled confidently. "Looking forward to adding another victory to my record, Reynolds." The good-natured banter was typical among the tank commanders at Knox. Unlike Camp Gordon under Harrison's command, here there was a spirit of camaraderie and shared purpose, even in competition. "The exercise begins at Euro 900, Adler concluded. "Prepare your crews and devise your strategies. Remember, gentlemen, in 3 months, many of you will be doing this against Rommel's panzers, not each other. Learn these lessons now, while the only consequence of failure is a bruised ego. As the meeting dispersed, Thomas returned to the barracks where his crew waited. The men had changed subtly during their time at Knox. Martinez had gained additional mechanical expertise working alongside the maintenance teams. Miller had absorbed volumes of technical intelligence about German armor. Donovan had refined his gunnery skills on the advanced range facilities. Even young O'Brien had grown more confident, setting records in the loaders competition the previous week. "What's the scenario, Captain?" Donovan asked as Thomas entered. "Desert warfare, North African theater," Thomas replied, spreading out his notes on the table. "We're leading Blue Force against Westbrook's Red Force, 7 tanks each, with Red Force simulating German tactics." "Westbrook," Martinez grinned. "That should be interesting. He's good, but conventional." Thomas nodded, "Which is why we won't be conventional. Here's what I'm thinking." For the next hour, they discussed Thomas's plan, refining details and considering contingencies. Unlike the rigid command structure Harrison had enforced, Thomas encouraged input from every member of the crew, recognizing that each brought valuable perspective to the planning process. By the time they mounted Iron Justice for the exercise, every man understood not just his role, but the entire strategic concept. More importantly, they had the flexibility to adapt if conditions changed, a lesson Thomas had learned from studying his father's journals. The exercise area covered several square miles of Kentucky terrain, chosen for its similarity to the North African desert. While not as barren or vast, the rolling hills and scattered vegetation provided comparable tactical challenges. Each tank had been fitted with special training equipment that registered hits from the opposing force's weapons, allowing realistic combat simulation without actual firing. Thomas positioned his tank on a ridge overlooking the exercise area, the other 6 Blue Force tanks spread out according to his instructions. From this vantage point, he could observe Red Force's initial deployment through his binoculars. "Westbrook's moving exactly as expected," Thomas noted. "Standard German wedge formation advancing up the Central Valley." "He's expecting us to meet him head-on," Donovan commented. "Typical American response." "Which is why we won't," Thomas replied, lowering his binoculars. "Martinez, signal the other tanks. Execute Phase 1. Instead of meeting Red Force directly, Blue Force remained concealed, allowing Westbrook's tanks to advance unopposed into the valley. Thomas had positioned his forces on the flanking ridges, waiting for the perfect moment. "Red Force passing checkpoint Alpha," Miller reported, monitoring the radio. "All units in position. Execute Phase 2, Thomas ordered. 2 Blue Force tanks revealed themselves briefly on the far ridge, firing simulation rounds before quickly retreating. As anticipated, Westbrook took the bait, ordering his formation to pivot and pursue what appeared to be retreating enemies. "They're committing," Thomas observed. "Phase 3 in 30 seconds. The true trap was now set. As Red Force altered course to pursue the decoy tanks, they exposed their flanks to the remaining Blue Force tanks hidden along the ridges. "All units, commence firing," Thomas commanded. Iron Justice's gun simulation fired, registering a hit on one of Westbrook's tanks. Simultaneously, the other Blue Force tanks opened fire from multiple angles. Within minutes, 5 of the 7 Red Force tanks had been destroyed, their systems disabled by the training equipment. Westbrook, realizing too late the trap he'd entered, attempted to rally his remaining tanks for a counterattack. But Thomas had anticipated this move as well, positioning his reserve tanks to cut off any retreat. "Red Force is completely surrounded," Miller reported with satisfaction. "Signal ceasefire," Thomas ordered. "Exercise complete." Over the radio came Colonel Adler's voice. "Blue Force victory confirmed. All units return to base for debriefing." Later in the post-exercise analysis, Adler praised Thomas's unconventional approach. "Captain Reynolds demonstrated a principle our German adversaries have mastered. Never fight the battle your enemy expects." By using terrain and deception, Blue Force achieved victory against a numerically equal opponent with minimal losses. Thomas accepted the praise with professional modesty, but privately felt a deep satisfaction. His crew had performed flawlessly, each man executing his role with precision and adaptability. They were becoming the kind of tank crew that could survive the real battles awaiting them overseas. As they left the debriefing, Captain Westbrook approached, offering his hand. "Well played, Reynolds. You completely outmaneuvered me." "You fought according to the book," Thomas replied, shaking his hand. "In most situations, that would be the right approach." But you don't fight by the book, Westbrook observed. Thomas thought of his father, who had developed innovative tank tactics when the book on armored warfare was still being written. Let's just say I believe in adapting the book to the situation. Westbrook laughed. Well, I owe you a drink for that lesson. Officers Club, 2,000 hours? Thomas agreed, appreciating the camaraderie that existed here at Knox, so different from the atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry Harrison had fostered at Gordon. That evening at the Officers Club, Thomas found himself surrounded by fellow tank commanders, sharing experiences and insights in an informal setting that often proved more valuable than official briefings. These men would soon be fighting the same enemies, facing the same challenges across the battlefields of Europe and Africa. Reynolds, a voice called from across the room. Thomas turned to see Colonel Adler motioning him over to a table where he sat with an officer Thomas didn't recognize. Colonel, Thomas acknowledged as he approached. Captain Reynolds, meet Lieutenant Colonel David Marshall, newly arrived from Washington. He's here to observe our training program and provide some updates on the European situation. Marshall stood to shake Thomas's hand. Captain, your tactical approach today was impressive. Reminded me of some of the more innovative British commanders I've observed. Thank you, sir. Join us, Adler invited, gesturing to an empty chair. Marshall has some information that might interest you particularly. Thomas sat, curious about the colonel's statement. Marshall leaned forward slightly. I understand you had some irregular experiences at Camp Gordon before your transfer here. The careful phrasing and Adler's knowing look told Thomas this wasn't casual conversation. Yes, sir. My crew participated in an unorthodox testing program. Under Colonel William Harrison, Marshall stated rather than asked. A program that ended with your crew taking evasive action to avoid a direct hit from a German 88. Thomas studied Marshall carefully before responding. That's correct, sir. May I ask how you're familiar with those events? Because I've been tasked with investigating certain anomalies in our armored testing programs, Marshall replied. Specifically incidents where test parameters were altered without proper authorization, endangering personnel and equipment. Adler cleared his throat. Marshall is with Army Inspector General's office, Thomas. He's conducting an official inquiry into Harrison's activities. The revelation surprised Thomas. Matthews had mentioned an investigation, but he hadn't expected it to reach the Inspector General's level so quickly. We've received evidence suggesting a pattern of irregularities, Marshall continued. Your incident was not the first, just the most recent, and the most blatant. The photographs, Thomas realized, Colonel Matthews had them developed. Marshall nodded. Among other evidence, your crew's testimony would be valuable to our investigation. Thomas considered the request carefully. An Inspector General investigation represented a serious escalation, one that Harrison would fight with every resource at his disposal. My men will cooperate fully, sir, Thomas decided. They witnessed everything firsthand. Excellent. Marshall sipped his drink. We'll conduct formal interviews tomorrow. For now, let's discuss a different matter. He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. Your transfer to Knox was intended to be temporary, but circumstances have changed. The 2nd Armored Division, including Harrison's command, has received deployment orders. They ship out for England next month, then on to North Africa. The news hit Thomas with unexpected force. While he had no desire to return to Harrison's command, the thought of the division deploying without iron justice in its crew struck at his professional pride. They had trained for combat, not to sit out the war in Kentucky. I understand your concern, Marshall said, reading Thomas's expression. You're worried your crew will miss the action. With respect, sir, that's precisely why we joined this branch, to take the fight to the enemy. Adler exchanged glances with Marshall before speaking. That's being addressed, Thomas. You and your crew aren't being sidelined. In fact, quite the opposite. Sir, you're being reassigned, Marshall explained, along with select other crews from this training group. Special deployment, high priority. Where? Thomas asked. Not where you might expect, Marshall replied. But I'm afraid that's all I can say for now. Official orders will come through next week. The cryptic statement left Thomas with more questions than answers, but he recognized the security restrictions that surrounded deployment orders. Whatever this special assignment entailed, it would become clear soon enough. As Thomas returned to his quarters that night, his mind worked through the possibilities. A special deployment could mean many things. A unique combat assignment, a specialized training mission, or perhaps attachment to a different allied force. Whatever lay ahead, at least they were moving forward, not sitting out the war in a training camp. The following day, Marshall interviewed each member of Thomas's crew individually, taking detailed statements about the incident at Camp Gordon. The formal nature of the proceedings underscored the seriousness of the investigation, and Thomas knew Harrison would soon face questions he couldn't easily dismiss. After the interviews concluded, Marshall met briefly with Thomas alone. "Your men's accounts are remarkably consistent," Marshall observed, "and they match exactly with the photographic evidence. They're good soldiers, sir. They report what they observe accurately." "Indeed." Marshall closed his notebook. "There's something else you should know, Reynolds. This investigation extends beyond Harrison now. We're looking into Allied defense systems in their executive Lawrence Whitfield." The mention of Whitfield confirmed Thomas's suspicions about the corporate connection. "Industrial espionage?" "And potentially worse," Marshall replied grimly. "We have evidence suggesting Whitfield's company may have shared technical specifications with German firms before the war through Swiss intermediaries. Specifications that may have influenced the development of weapons specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in American tanks." The implications were staggering. If true, it meant Allied defense had not only endangered American tank crews for profit, but had potentially aided the enemy in developing more effective anti-tank weapons. "My father's journal," Thomas said quietly. "He discovered Harrison providing similar data to Whitfield's uncle during the First World War. It wasn't just about corporate advantage then either." Marshall nodded. "We're aware of your father's documentation. Major Wilson brought it to our attention. It establishes a historical pattern that strengthens our current case." "Harrison won't go down easily," Thomas warned. "He has powerful protection in Washington." "Had," Marshall corrected. "The political landscape is shifting rapidly since Pearl Harbor. Former connections are being scrutinized for potential conflicts of interest or divided loyalties." He gathered his papers. In wartime, the rules change, even for men like Harrison. As Marshall departed, Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication for his father's long-buried accusations, satisfaction that Harrison might finally face consequences for his actions, but also concern about the broader implications for American armor and the men who crewed it. If Allied defense had compromised tank designs, how many lives had been lost as a result? How many more would be lost before the issue could be corrected? These questions weighed heavily on Thomas as he rejoined his crew in the maintenance bay, where they were conducting routine checks on Iron Justice. The men worked with the easy coordination that came from shared experience and mutual trust, each anticipating the needs of the others without direction. "How did your interviews go?" Thomas asked as he climbed up beside Donovan, who was making minor adjustments to the turret mechanism. "Straightforward, sir," the gunner replied. Marshall seemed particularly interested in Whitfield and the civilians at the test site. Martinez looked up from the engine compartment, his face streaked with grease. "Same here. He asked a lot about the modifications made to the test parameters and who authorized them." "You think Harrison will finally get what's coming to him?" O'Brien asked, his youthful face serious. Thomas considered the question carefully. "The investigation has momentum now. Harrison has enemies as well as friends in high places. But our focus needs to be elsewhere." "The special deployment," Miller suggested, showing his usual perceptiveness. "Exactly." Thomas gathered them closer. "Whatever this assignment is, it's taking us away from Harrison's direct influence. That's good, but it also means we're heading into unknown territory without the support of the larger division." "We've got all the support we need right here," Martinez declared, gesturing to the 5 of them in Iron Justice. "This crew against whatever they throw at us." The confidence wasn't bravado, it was earned through shared danger and rigorous training. Thomas felt the same certainty in their capabilities, though he maintained the cautious perspective his position required. "Marshall mentioned our orders will arrive next week," Thomas told them. "Until then, we continue training as if we're shipping out to North Africa. Whatever our actual destination, the fundamentals remain the same." For the next several days, they intensified their preparation, running combat simulations, studying intelligence reports on German armor, and fine-tuning Iron Justice's systems for maximum performance. Thomas drove them hard, knowing that in actual combat, their lives would depend on these skills becoming second nature. Then, as promised, their orders arrived. Thomas was summoned to Colonel Adler's office, where the older officer handed him a sealed envelope. "These came directly from Army headquarters, Thomas. Top priority." Adler's expression was unreadable. "I've been briefed on your assignment. It's unconventional." Thomas opened the envelope and read the orders inside. As he absorbed their contents, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Is this accurate, sir?" Adler nodded. "Completely. Your crew and 4 others from this program are being attached to a British armored unit for a special operation. You'll be serving under British command, though maintaining your American rank and identity. The orders detailed their immediate transfer to a naval base for transport to England, where they would join the British Royal Armoured Corps for specialized training before deployment. May I ask the nature of this operation, sir? You'll be fully briefed in England, Adler replied. All I can tell you is that it involves a combined Allied effort requiring American Sherman tanks with experienced crews who can operate independently with minimal support. Thomas considered the unusual assignment. Serving under British command would be a new experience, but it also offered a unique opportunity to learn from soldiers who had been fighting the Germans since 1939. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning, 0600. Adler stood and offered his hand. I've been impressed with your work here, Reynolds. Your father would be proud of the officer you've become. Thank you, sir. One more thing, Adler added as Thomas turned to leave. Lieutenant Colonel Marshall asked me to inform you that Harrison has been temporarily relieved of command pending the outcome of the investigation. He won't be deploying with the 2nd Armored Division as planned. The news was unexpected, but welcome. Whatever the final result of the investigation, Harrison would not be in position to endanger more tank crews in the immediate future. That's good to hear, sir. Indeed, Adler agreed. Though I should warn you, Harrison still has allies, and men like him rarely go quietly. Watch your back, even overseas. Thomas nodded, taking the warning seriously. Harrison had demonstrated his vindictiveness and his long memory. Even with an ocean between them, Thomas would need to remain vigilant. That evening, Thomas briefed his crew on their new assignment. Their reactions ranged from surprise to excitement at the prospect of serving alongside the British. Royal Armored Corps, Donovan mused. They've been fighting Rommel's best for years now. We could learn a lot from them. And they from us, Thomas pointed out. The Sherman is superior to most of their current tanks. Our experience with this vehicle will be valuable to their operations. Any word on what this special operation entails? Miller asked. Not yet. We'll be briefed in England. Thomas looked around at his crew, men who had become more than colleagues in the months since they'd first assembled at Camp Gordon. This assignment takes us well outside normal channels. We'll be operating far from conventional support, under foreign command, likely in high-risk scenarios. Sounds like my kind of assignment, Martinez grinned. O'Brien, though still the youngest and least experienced, nodded firmly. We're ready, sir. Thomas felt a surge of pride in these men who had faced danger both from the enemy and from within their own ranks, emerging stronger and more unified with each challenge. Get some rest, he instructed them. Tomorrow begins a new chapter for Iron Justice and her crew. As the men dispersed to prepare for their departure, Thomas remained alone with the tank for a moment, running his hand along the cold steel that had protected them through their trials so far. Tomorrow they would leave American soil, heading toward a war that had already consumed much of Europe and North Africa. Whatever special mission awaited them in England, Thomas was confident that Iron Justice would carry them through it, just as she had carried them through Harrison's deadly test. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The crew of Iron Justice was forged in adversity, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Together they would face the storm of war, and Thomas silently vowed they would survive it. Chapter 6. Across the Pond. Atlantic Ocean, April 1942. The converted luxury liner rolled in the heavy seas of the North Atlantic, its gray wartime paint a stark contrast to the vibrant colors it had once displayed in peacetime. Now part of a large convoy carrying troops and equipment to England, the ship zigzagged constantly to avoid the German U-boats that hunted in these waters. Thomas stood at the rail on the windward side, letting the salt spray sting his face. 5 days into their crossing, he had grown accustomed to the ship's constant movement, though many soldiers remained confined to their bunks, struggling with seasickness. Penny for your thoughts, Captain. Thomas turned to find Captain Edward Winters of the British Liaison Office standing beside him. The Englishman had joined their transport in New York, assigned to prepare the American tank crews for their integration into British units. Just wondering what we're sailing into, Captain Winters. Winters smiled wryly. Besides the distinct possibility of torpedoes, you mean? He pulled his naval coat tighter against the wind. I understand your curiosity about the assignment. I'm afraid I know little more than you at this point. Orders to meet your crews and escort you to England. The details await us there. Despite his limited information, Winters had proven a valuable companion during the crossing. His 3 years of combat experience against the Germans had provided Thomas and the other American tank commanders with insights no training program could offer. Your men are adapting well to the crossing, Winters observed. Better than most of the infantry replacements. Tank crews are used to confined spaces and constant motion, Thomas replied. Though I'm not sure Martinez will ever forgive me for bringing him on a ship. He says the engines are calling for proper maintenance, and the crew won't let him near them. Winters laughed. Yes, ship engineers tend to be rather territorial. He grew more serious. I've been meaning to ask about something, Reynolds. There are rumors circulating among the American officers about your crew's previous posting. Something about an incident during testing? Thomas measured his response carefully. Winters had been forthcoming with valuable information, but the Harrison situation remained sensitive. We participated in a weapons evaluation that didn't go according to protocol, Thomas said simply. There's an ongoing investigation. Winters studied him thoughtfully. I see. We had similar incidents early in the war. Testing new vehicles and weapons under pressure sometimes leads to shortcuts. Lost some good men before proper procedures were established. The Englishman's diplomatic phrasing suggested he understood more than Thomas had explicitly stated. Perhaps similar issues had arisen within the British military establishment. The important thing, Winters continued, is that your crew survived and is now heading where they're needed. The experience may serve you well in what's coming. And what exactly is coming, Captain Winters? Thomas pressed, sensing the Englishman might know more than he had admitted. Winters gazed out at the gray horizon. I can tell you this much. The operation you're joining isn't in North Africa, despite what many assume. It's something different, something that requires specific skills and equipment. He glanced at Thomas. How much do you know about combined operations, Captain? Coordination between different branches? Army, Navy, Air Forces? Precisely. And between different nations as well. Winters lowered his voice, though the wind would have carried away any eavesdropper's attempts to listen. Churchill and Roosevelt have authorized a series of experiments, testing German defenses, gathering intelligence, developing tactics for something larger in the future. Thomas understood the implication. Raids on occupied Europe. Winters neither confirmed nor denied, but his expression was answer enough. Your Sherman tanks offer capabilities our current armor can't match. Combined with crews experienced enough to operate independently, he let the thought hang incomplete, but Thomas could fill in the blanks. They were being sent to participate in commando-style operations, using their tanks in ways they hadn't been designed for. The prospect was both daunting and exhilarating. My crew will be ready for whatever comes, Thomas assured him. I believe they will, Winters replied. You've forged them into a unit that thinks and acts as one. That's rare, Reynolds, even among experienced crews. The compliment was unexpected, but gratifying. Winters had observed Thomas's crew during their daily maintenance and training sessions aboard ship, apparently seeing the cohesion Thomas had worked to build. It helps that they've faced danger together already, Thomas acknowledged. Nothing builds trust like shared survival. Indeed. Winters pushed away from the railing. We should be arriving in Liverpool within 3 days, assuming the weather and U-boats permit. From there, you'll be transported to a facility near Portsmouth for your official briefing. As Winters departed, Thomas remained at the rail, considering the Englishman's carefully worded revelations. Commando raids on occupied Europe would be high-risk, high-reward operations, exactly the kind of mission that required crews who could think independently and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Below decks, Thomas found his crew in their assigned quarters, engaged in various activities to pass the time. Martinez was disassembling and reassembling a machine gun with practiced efficiency, while Miller studied a manual on British armored tactics. Donovan and O'Brien were engaged in a chess match, the older man patiently explaining strategy to his young protege. Gentlemen, Thomas greeted them, I've just had an interesting conversation with Captain Winters. The men looked up expectantly. He couldn't provide specifics, but I believe our assignment involves combined operations against occupied Europe. Raid tactics, not conventional armored warfare. Commando stuff? Martinez asked, his hands continuing their mechanical work without his conscious attention. Tanks aren't exactly subtle, Captain. No, but they provide firepower that commandos typically lack, Miller observed thoughtfully. A Sherman could be decisive in neutralizing German strongpoints or covering an extraction. Donovan moved a chess piece, putting O'Brien's king in check. What about naval transport? Getting tanks on and off beaches isn't standard procedure. The British have been developing specialized landing craft, Thomas informed them. Part of our training will likely involve practicing amphibious operations. The concept was new to all of them. Traditional tank doctrine focused on land maneuvers, not waterborne assault. The idea of driving a 26-ton vehicle off a boat onto a beach, possibly under fire, presented challenges none of their training had addressed. This is why they selected experienced crews, Thomas continued. We'll be adapting to new tactics and technologies with minimal preparation time. How many other crews are involved? Miller asked. 4 from Fort Knox, plus an unknown number of British tanks, Thomas replied. A small force for whatever they're planning. O'Brien, who had been quietly contemplating his chess predicament, looked up. So we'll be the first Americans to take the fight directly to Hitler's Europe? Thomas nodded. It appears that way. A smile spread across the young loader's face. My father always said the Lord works in mysterious ways. When I enlisted, I never imagined anything like this. None of us did, Donovan agreed, gently reminding O'Brien of his pending checkmate. But we train for whatever comes. Thomas watched his crew absorb the information, each man processing it through the lens of his own experience and personality. Martinez saw the mechanical challenges. Miller analyzed the tactical implications. Donovan assessed the combat realities. O'Brien found meaning in being part of something historic. Together, they formed a complete unit, each member compensating for the other's limitations. We'll know more when we reach England, Thomas told them. For now, continue your preparations. Study British terminology and procedures. Their armored forces operate differently than ours in some respects. As the men returned to their activities, Thomas reflected on how far they had come since their first meeting at Camp Gordon. From strangers assigned to the same vehicle, they had become a true crew, their individual skills blending into a cohesive whole greater than the sum of its parts. Whatever challenges awaited them in England and beyond, Thomas was confident they would face them together. 3 days later, their convoy arrived safely in Liverpool, having evaded the U-boat packs that prowled the shipping lanes. As the troops disembarked, Thomas and his crew got their first glimpse of a nation at war. Liverpool had suffered heavily under German bombing. Many buildings stood as empty shells, their interiors gutted by fire while their facades remained eerily intact. Barrage balloons floated above the city like silver sentinels, designed to force enemy aircraft to higher altitudes or risk entanglement. Everywhere, evidence of rationing and sacrifice was visible, from the absence of young men to the carefully maintained vehicles that had clearly been in service long past their normal lifespan. Quite a sight, isn't it? Winters remarked as he joined them on the dock. 2.5 years of war leaves its mark. I had no idea the damage was so extensive, Thomas admitted, surveying the bombed-out warehouses along the waterfront. Liverpool's received special attention from the Luftwaffe due to its importance as a port, Winters explained. London, Coventry, Portsmouth, they've all had their share as well. He gestured to a convoy of trucks waiting nearby. Your transportation to the training facility is ready. Iron Justice and the other Shermans will follow by rail. The journey from Liverpool to the south coast provided Thomas and his crew with their first real glimpse of the English countryside. Despite the war, the landscape retained its timeless quality, rolling green hills dotted with villages that had stood for centuries. Yet even here, signs of conflict were evident. Fighter bases carved from farmland, anti-aircraft batteries positioned near strategic crossroads, and the occasional crashed German bomber left where it had fallen, its aluminum skin scavenged for the war effort. After several hours, their convoy turned onto a narrow road leading to what appeared to be an ordinary country estate. High stone walls surrounded the property, but Thomas noticed the modern additions: guard posts, communications antennas, and carefully concealed defensive positions. Thwaite Hall, Winters announced as they passed through the gates. Country home of Lord Someone or Other, now repurposed as Combined Operations Training Center 4. Home for the next 2 weeks while you prepare for your mission. The manor house itself had been converted to offices and briefing rooms, while the surrounding grounds housed barracks, motor pools, and training areas. As they drove past the motor pool, Thomas spotted their Shermans, already delivered by rail and lined up alongside several British Crusader tanks. Your quarters are in the East Wing, Winters informed them as they disembarked. Get settled, then report to the main hall at 1800 hours for your initial briefing. The accommodations were Spartan but comfortable, a significant improvement over the cramped ship quarters they'd endured for the past week. The men quickly stowed their gear and took the opportunity to shower and change into fresh uniforms before the briefing. At precisely 1800, Thomas led his crew to the main hall, where the other American tank commanders and their crews had already assembled. The room, once a grand dining hall for the estate's noble owners, now served as a command center. Maps covered the walls, communications equipment occupied one corner, and a large table dominated the center of the space. Standing at the head of the table was a British officer Thomas didn't recognize. Of medium height with a weathered face and the insignia of a colonel, he exuded the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "Gentlemen, welcome to England," the colonel began without preamble as the last crews took their places. "I am Colonel Robert Sinclair, commanding officer of Special Armored Group, Combined Operations Command. For the next 6 months, you'll be under my authority, though you remain part of the United States Army in all official respects." Sinclair paced slowly as he spoke, making eye contact with each crew commander. "You have been selected for a series of operations that will take Allied forces directly to the enemy's doorstep. These are not conventional armored engagements. They are precision strikes against specific targets, followed by immediate extraction. Your Sherman tanks provide capabilities our current armor lacks, particularly in terms of reliability, firepower, and crew protection." He moved to a covered map on the wall and pulled away the cloth to reveal the coast of France. "Operations will target key installations along the French coast, from Calais to Cherbourg. Intelligence gathering, destruction of radar facilities, elimination of coastal batteries, and when opportunity presents, capture of German personnel with valuable intelligence value." The scope of the mission was becoming clear. They would be conducting hit-and-run operations against Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the network of defenses the Germans had constructed along the occupied coastline. Each operation will involve between 2 and 6 tanks, depending on the target and available intelligence, Sinclair continued. You will work in conjunction with commandos from No. 4 Commando, specialists in coastal raids. Naval transport will be provided by the Royal Navy's landing craft tank units. Thomas studied the map, noting the heavily defended areas marked in red. The French coast was a formidable objective, especially for small-scale raids. The Germans had spent 2 years fortifying these areas against exactly the type of operations Sinclair was describing. "Your training begins tomorrow at WWII 500, Sinclair informed them. "It will include amphibious landing procedures, coordination with infantry commandos, night operations, and rapid extraction techniques. We have 2 weeks to prepare for the first mission." The compressed timeline raised eyebrows among the American crews. Standard training for new operations typically took months, not weeks. Sinclair seemed to read their thoughts. "I understand this is an accelerated schedule. War doesn't always afford us the luxury of extended preparation. You were selected because your crews have demonstrated exceptional adaptability and skill. We will build on that foundation rather than starting from scratch." The colonel gestured to another British officer who began distributing folders to each crew commander. "These contain the specific details of your training schedule and initial mission parameters. Study them carefully. Operational security is paramount. The success of these missions depends on complete surprise." Thomas accepted his folder, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented, not just for his crew's lives, but for the success of a new type of combined operation that could shape future strategy. "One final note," Sinclair concluded. "These operations are classified at the highest level. Their existence is known only to select personnel within Combined Operations Command and your own chain of command. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, you are here for standard training exercises with British armored units." With that, the colonel dismissed them to review their materials and prepare for the intensive training period ahead. As the crews dispersed, Thomas noticed Captain Winters approaching with a British tank commander in tow. "Reynolds," Winters called, "I'd like you to meet Major James Harrington, commander of C Squadron, Royal Tank Regiment. He'll be leading the British element of your first operation." Harrington was tall and lean, with the confident bearing of a career officer. His uniform showed the wear of active service, and a thin scar ran along his left jawline. "Captain Reynolds," he greeted Thomas with a firm handshake. "I've heard good things about your crew's performance." "Thank you, sir. We're looking forward to working with your unit." "Excellent. Perhaps you'd join me for a drink? I find informal discussions often accomplish more than official briefings." Thomas accepted, and soon found himself in what had once been the estate's library, now converted to an officer's lounge. Harrington poured 2 glasses of whiskey and settled into a leather chair opposite Thomas. "To successful cooperation," the major toasted, raising his glass. Thomas returned the gesture, sipping the amber liquid. It was good scotch, a rarity even in England with wartime restrictions. "I'll be direct, Reynolds," Harrington began after a moment. "These operations we're undertaking are experimental. Tanks have never been used in this manner before, landing directly on enemy beaches for short-duration strikes. The theory is sound, but the practice, he shrugged. Let's just say there are many variables. Including the response time of German mobile reserves, Thomas suggested. Harrington nodded appreciatively. Precisely. Once we land, we have a limited window before they can bring significant forces to bear. That's why we're focusing on quick strikes against specific targets rather than establishing beachheads. What about air support? Thomas asked. The Luftwaffe still controls the skies over northern France. We'll operate primarily at night with RAF fighter cover during extraction at dawn, Harrington explained. It's not ideal, but it's what's available. He studied Thomas for a moment. You have concerns. It wasn't a question. Thomas considered how to respond to a superior officer who was inviting candor. Not concerns so much as questions, sir. Our crews are trained for conventional armored warfare. This mission requires a significant adaptation in tactics and mindset. Indeed it does, Harrington agreed. But conventional warfare has reached something of a stalemate. North Africa swings back and forth like a pendulum. The Eastern Front is a meat grinder. We need new approaches to break the deadlock. He leaned forward. Churchill believes these raids serve two purposes: gathering intelligence for larger operations in the future and demonstrating to the Germans that their coastline is not impregnable. And to show the Soviets we're actively engaging the enemy, Thomas added, understanding the political dimension. That too, Harrington acknowledged with a slight smile. Stalin has been rather insistent about a second front. They discussed the upcoming training in detail, Harrington providing insights that hadn't been covered in the official briefing. The major had participated in several small-scale raids already, though without tanks, and his experience would be invaluable. As their conversation wound down, Harrington fixed Thomas with a serious look. There's something else you should know, Reynolds. These operations carry significant risk. We anticipate casualties. All combat operations do, sir. Yes, but these are different. We're deliberately inserting small forces into heavily defended territory with limited support. The potential for crews to be killed or captured is higher than in conventional engagements. Harrington's expression was grim. I've lost men on previous raids. Good men. I'll likely lose more before this is over. The candid assessment was sobering, but not surprising. Thomas had understood the high-risk nature of their assignment from the moment Winters had first hinted at it. My crew understands the risks, sir. They've faced danger before and performed admirably. So I've heard, Harrington replied. Something about an incident during testing back in the States. Thomas tensed slightly, surprised that news of the Harrison affair had reached British officers. There was a situation, yes. No need for details, Harrington assured him. I only mention it because it speaks well of your crew that they've already demonstrated courage under fire, even if that fire came from an unexpected direction. He finished his drink. In my experience, the best crews are those that have been tested before they reach the battlefield. Your men have had that test and passed. It gives you an advantage many others lack. The insight was perceptive and oddly comforting. Thomas had worried that the Harrison incident might be viewed as a black mark on their record. Instead, Harrington saw it as valuable experience. Thank you for your candor, sir, Thomas said as they stood to leave. My crew will be ready. I believe they will, Harrington replied. Get some rest, Reynolds. Tomorrow begins the most intensive training you are likely to experience. As Thomas returned to the quarters he shared with his crew, he found the men already studying the materials from the briefing, each focusing on the aspects most relevant to his role. How was your meeting with the Major? Donovan asked, looking up from a map of the French coastline. Informative, Thomas replied, setting his cap aside. He's experienced with raids, though not with tanks. We'll be breaking new ground with these operations. Amphibious Sherman tanks, Martinez mused, reviewing the technical modifications their vehicles would receive. Never thought I'd see the day. They're fitting them with waterproofing for the engine intakes and exhaust, Miller explained, showing a technical diagram. Not for deep water, but enough to drive off a landing craft through the surf. O'Brien looked up from his own documents. Captain, these operations, they're the real thing, aren't they? Not just training exercises or tests. Yes, they are, Thomas confirmed. Direct action against German-occupied territory. Probably the first American armor to engage the enemy in the European theater. The young loader nodded solemnly. Then we'd better not disappoint. We won't, Thomas assured him, looking around at his crew, men who had become as close as brothers through shared danger and purpose. Iron Justice has carried us this far. She'll carry us onto those beaches and back again. As the men returned to their study, Thomas opened his own folder to review the detailed operation plans. The mission ahead would test them as nothing before had, facing a determined enemy on ground of his choosing. Yet Thomas felt a sense of readiness, a confidence born not of bravado, but of earned trust in his crew's abilities and their Sherman's reliable strength. Whatever challenges awaited on the shores of occupied France, Iron Justice and her crew would meet them together. The real war, their war, was about to begin. The English Channel, June 1942. Darkness shrouded the small flotilla as it cut through the choppy waters of the channel. 5 landing craft, specially modified to carry tanks, moved in tight formation behind the lead vessel, a converted British torpedo boat. No lights were visible, no radio communications permitted. The only sounds were the muffled engines and the constant slap of waves against the hulls. Inside the lead landing craft, Thomas Reynolds stood in the commander's hatch of Iron Justice, the cool night air filling his lungs as he studied the distant shoreline of occupied France through night vision binoculars. The coast was just visible as a darker line against the night sky, ominously quiet and seemingly deserted. He knew better. German coastal defenses dotted those beaches, the first line of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. 5 minutes to landing zone, the British naval officer whispered from beside the tank. Lieutenant Commander James Blackwood had been assigned as their naval liaison for the operation, responsible for getting the tanks safely to shore and, more importantly, extracting them when the mission was complete. Thomas nodded acknowledgement and dropped down into the turret, closing the hatch behind him. Inside the Sherman, his crew waited in tense silence, each man focused on his instruments and equipment, illuminated only by the dull red glow of the combat lights. 5 minutes, gentlemen, Thomas relayed. Final checks. In the cramped confines of the tank, each man performed his assigned pre-combat routine with practiced efficiency. Donovan confirmed the main gun was loaded with high explosive, ready to engage the primary target. Martinez monitored the waterproofed engine, ensuring it maintained optimal temperature despite the modifications. Miller checked radio frequencies, ready to coordinate with the commandos who had landed hours earlier to secure the beachhead. O'Brien verified ammunition counts one last time, his young face set with determination. Captain Winters asked me to wish you luck, Blackwood's voice came through the intercom. He'd have come himself, but he's coordinating the second wave. Thank him for us, Thomas replied. Edward Winters had become a trusted colleague during their training in England, providing invaluable insights into German coastal defenses based on previous raid experiences. The landing craft lurched as it hit a larger wave, reminding them all of the precarious nature of their transport. Tanks were never designed to come ashore from the sea, yet here they were, about to attempt exactly that. The past month had been filled with specialized training for this moment, practicing driving off landing craft into surf, operating with waterproofed engines, coordinating with infantry commandos, and executing rapid extraction when objectives were complete. Remember, once Iron Justice touches French soil, we have exactly 90 minutes to complete our objectives and return to the extraction point, Thomas reminded his crew. After that, the tide shifts and extraction becomes impossible. Time enough to deliver some payback, Donovan remarked grimly, adjusting his gunner's sight. Just enough time to do the job and get out, Thomas corrected. This isn't about vengeance. It's about disrupting German radar capabilities and gathering intelligence. Their mission was precise. Destroy a newly installed Freya radar installation that had been detecting and directing attacks on Allied bombing raids. A secondary objective was to capture technical documentation if possible. The British commandos would secure the approaches, while Iron Justice and one other, Sherman, provided the heavy firepower needed to breach the facility's defenses. 2 minutes to landing, Miller reported, monitoring the naval communications. Waterproofing integrity confirmed, Martinez added. Engine running perfectly. Thomas felt the familiar calm settling over him, the clarity that always came in the moments before action. They had trained extensively for this operation, but no training could fully prepare them for what awaited on that beach. The only certainty was that Iron Justice and her crew would face it together, as they had faced every challenge since their first meeting at Camp Gordon. 1 minute, Miller announced. Commandos report beachhead secure. Minimal resistance encountered. That will change when they hear us coming, Thomas noted. 5 Sherman tanks couldn't exactly sneak ashore unnoticed. The landing craft slowed as it approached the beach. its bow grinding against the sandy bottom. Thomas felt the deck tilt slightly as the front ramp began to lower. "Driver, prepare to advance," Thomas ordered. The ramp splashed down into 2 feet of water. Through the open bow, Thomas could see the dark beach ahead, illuminated faintly by starlight. "Iron Justice, forward!" Thomas commanded. Martinez engaged the drive, and the Sherman rolled down the ramp with a splash, water reaching halfway up the treads as it advanced toward dry land. The waterproofed engine continued to run smoothly despite the unnatural environment, carrying them through the surf and onto the firm sand of the beach. "We're on French soil," O'Brien whispered, a touch of awe in his voice. "First American tank in occupied France," Miller confirmed, marking the historic moment. Thomas had no time for sentiment. "Driver, proceed to Rally Point Alpha. Standard speed, minimal noise." As Iron Justice moved inland, Thomas could see shadowy figures emerging from defensive positions along the beach. British commandos in battle gear, their faces blackened with combat cosmetics, nodded in recognition as the tanks passed. These elite soldiers had secured the immediate area, eliminating German sentries with silenced weapons and knives. Captain John McAllister, commander of the commando unit, appeared beside the tank as they reached the rally point, a small depression just beyond the beach. Thomas opened his hatch to confer with the British officer. "Welcome to France, Captain Reynolds," McAllister whispered with typical British understatement. "Lovely night for a raid, wouldn't you say?" "Status report?" Thomas asked, all business. "Beach and approach secured," McAllister replied, his tone shifting to match Thomas's professionalism. "We've neutralized the forward observation post without raising the alarm. Radar facility is 2 kilometers inland, still fully operational and unaware of our presence." "German response capabilities?" "Nearest significant reinforcements are at Saint Laurent, 20 minutes away if alerted. The facility itself has approximately 30 personnel, including technical staff, and a defense platoon with 2 20mm anti-aircraft guns that can be depressed for ground targets." Thomas nodded, absorbing the information. "We'll proceed as planned then. Your men take flanking positions. We'll advance up the main access road and engage any defensive positions. Second tank will provide rear security." "Understood," McAllister agreed. "My demo team is ready to place charges once you've breached the perimeter. Technical specialists standing by to retrieve documentation." As the commando leader moved away to position his men, Thomas dropped back into the turret and closed the hatch. "You heard the man. Let's move." Iron Justice advanced cautiously along the narrow coastal road, its engine muted as much as possible. Behind them, the second Sherman followed at a distance of 50 meters, while commando teams moved through the fields on either side, maintaining pace with the armor. The night remained eerily quiet. No aircraft overhead, no distant artillery. This sector of the Atlantic Wall was lightly defended compared to areas like Calais or Cherbourg, which was precisely why it had been chosen for this raid. Still, Thomas remained alert for any sign of German patrols or early warning systems. "Radar facility visible," Miller reported after 15 minutes of steady advance. 1 kilometer ahead on the ridgeline. Thomas raised his binoculars. The facility stood silhouetted against the night sky, its distinctive radar array rotating slowly, sweeping the skies for Allied aircraft. Surrounding it was a perimeter fence with what appeared to be a single guarded entrance. The 20mm anti-aircraft guns McAllister had mentioned were positioned on elevated platforms within the compound. "No sign they've detected us," Thomas observed. "Donovan, target the eastern gun emplacement first, then shift to the western. O'Brien, have he ready, then AP if we encounter any armored resistance." "Understood, sir," both men acknowledged. Thomas switched to the command channel. "All elements, this is Iron Justice. We are commencing attack in 2 minutes. Commando teams, stand ready to exploit the breach." As final preparations were made, Thomas thought briefly of how far they had come. From their first meeting at Camp Gordon to the deadly test orchestrated by Harrison, through their specialized training at Fort Knox and in England, every experience had prepared them for this moment. They were about to become the first American tank crew to engage the enemy on French soil since 1980, when Thomas's father had fought in these same fields. "Iron Justice, advance," Thomas ordered. The Sherman surged forward, abandoning stealth for speed as it charged down the road toward the radar station. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage, and Thomas intended to maximize it. The German sentry at the gate barely had time to raise his rifle before Iron Justice crashed through the barrier, the wooden gate splintering under the tank's weight. Alarms began to sound throughout the facility as the Sherman roared into the compound. "Eastern gun emplacement, fire," Thomas commanded. Donovan swung the turret with practiced precision, the 75mm gun booming in the night. The high-explosive shell struck the anti-aircraft position directly, the explosion illuminating the entire compound for a brief, terrible moment. The gun and its crew vanished in fire and smoke. German personnel scrambled from buildings, some in uniform, others in various states of undress, all reacting to the sudden attack. Machine gun fire rattled against Iron Justice's armor, the rounds harmlessly deflected. Western emplacement traversing toward us, Miller warned. I see it, Donovan confirmed, already swinging the turret. Firing! The second 75mm round found its mark, silencing the remaining anti-aircraft gun before it could bring effective fire to bear on either the tank or the advancing commandos. Both emplacements neutralized, Thomas reported. Commando teams, move in. McAllister's men swarmed into the compound, engaging the remaining German defenders with precise small arms fire. The second Sherman took position at the entrance, its gun covering the road to prevent reinforcements from approaching. Drive to the main building, Thomas directed Martinez. We'll provide close support for the retrieval team. Iron Justice maneuvered through the chaos of the compound, its machine guns engaging targets of opportunity as German soldiers attempted to organize a defense. The radar facility's primary building loomed ahead, a two-story concrete structure housing both the technical equipment and the operations center. Demolition team moving in, Miller relayed from his radio. Technical team standing by. Thomas watched as commandos placed explosive charges on the radar array's base, while others engaged in close-quarters battle within the buildings. The operation was proceeding according to plan, but Thomas knew the clock was ticking. German reinforcements would be mobilizing, and their extraction window remained fixed by the tides. Miller time check, Thomas requested. 37 minutes since landing, the bowgunner reported. 53 minutes remaining until extraction. Inside the main building, McAllister's technical specialists would be searching for the documentation they needed. Maintenance manuals, calibration data, and operational procedures for the Freya radar system. Allied intelligence believed this information could help develop more effective countermeasures against German air defenses. A sudden explosion rocked the compound as the demolition team detonated their charges on the radar array. The massive structure toppled slowly, crashing to the ground in a tangle of twisted metal and broken components. One objective complete. Captain, Miller called urgently, radio intercept from St. Laurent. German mechanized patrol responding, estimated arrival 20 minutes. The complication wasn't unexpected, but it compressed their timeline dangerously. Alert McAllister, Thomas ordered. Tell him we need to expedite the document retrieval. As Miller relayed the message, a new threat emerged. From a concealed position near the compound's rear, a German half-track appeared, its mounted 37mm gun traversing toward Iron Justice. Half-track, 6 o'clock, Thomas shouted. Donovan! The turret swung around with agonizing slowness compared to the lighter German vehicle. The half-track fired first, its shell striking Iron Justice's side armor with a deafening clang. The Sherman rocked from the impact, but the armor held. Minimal damage, Martinez reported, already maneuvering to present a better firing angle. Port side track slightly damaged but functional. Donovan completed his turret traverse, the 75mm gun now pointed directly at the half-track. Target acquired. Fire, Thomas commanded. The Sherman's gun roared again, the high explosive shell transforming the lightly armored German vehicle into a fireball. The threat eliminated, Thomas quickly assessed the situation. Commando teams were beginning to disengage, falling back toward predetermined rally points. The technical team emerged from the main building, one man clutching a leather case that presumably contained the targeted documents. Primary and secondary objectives achieved, Miller confirmed. McAllister is ordering general withdrawal. Driver, position us to cover the retreat, Thomas directed. We'll be last out. Iron Justice took up a position where it could observe both the compound entrance and the approaching road. The second Sherman was already beginning to fall back, escorting the first group of commandos toward the beach. For 10 tense minutes, Iron Justice remained in position, its gun discouraging any German survivors from interfering with the withdrawal. When the last commando team signaled their clearance of the compound, Thomas gave the order to withdraw. Time check, he requested as Martinez reversed the tank, then turned it toward the coastal road. 58 minutes since landing, Miller reported. 32 minutes remaining for extraction. The timing was tight but manageable, assuming they encountered no further resistance. Thomas remained vigilant as Iron Justice rolled back along the route they had taken inland. The night had come alive now, with distant sirens and the occasional flare illuminating the countryside. The Germans were fully alert, searching for the raiders. "Vehicle approaching from the east," Donovan warned, scanning through his periscope. Thomas shifted his view to identify the contact. A German scout car was moving rapidly along a parallel road, likely attempting to intercept the withdrawing force before it could reach the beach. "Can you get a clean shot?" Thomas asked. Donovan adjusted his sights, compensating for the moving tank and moving target. "Ready." "Fire when ready," Thomas authorized. The gunner waited for the precise moment, then fired. The shell caught the scout car as it crossed an intersection, flipping it violently off the road. No secondary explosion followed, suggesting the fuel tank hadn't ignited. "Check for survivors," Thomas ordered, not wanting to leave anyone who might radio their position. Martinez slowed the tank as they approached the wreckage. Through his binoculars, Thomas could see two German soldiers crawling from the overturned vehicle, one dragging the other. "Miller, short burst, warning only," Thomas commanded. The bowgunner fired a quick burst from his machine gun, the rounds impacting the ground near the Germans. The message was clear: stay down, don't follow. Thomas had no desire to kill wounded men if unnecessary. Iron Justice continued toward the beach, making good time despite the slight damage to the port track. As they crested the final rise before the beach, Thomas could see the landing craft waiting at the shoreline, the second Sherman already being loaded. "We're cutting it close," Miller observed, checking his watch. 23 minutes until high tide shifts. "We'll make it," Thomas assured him, though he kept scanning for any sign of German reinforcements. The mechanized patrol reported earlier would be approaching the radar facility by now, but could easily be redirected to the beach if their withdrawal was spotted. As Iron Justice rolled onto the sand, Lieutenant Commander Blackwood waved them toward the waiting landing craft, its ramp already lowered in anticipation of their arrival. "Quickly now," the naval officer called. "German naval units have been alerted. We need to be well offshore before they can respond." Martinez guided the Sherman up the ramp and into the landing craft with practiced precision. The moment they were aboard, sailors began securing the tank while the ramp raised behind them. "All elements recovered," Blackwood confirmed, commencing withdrawal. Thomas felt the landing craft's engines increase power as it backed away from the beach. Only when they were fully waterborne did he allow himself a moment of relief. They had accomplished their mission and were homeward bound. "Damage report," he requested, wanting a full assessment now that the immediate danger had passed. "Port track damaged but intact," Martinez reported. "Minor dents to left side armor. No penetration. Ammunition expenditure, 3 high explosive rounds," O'Brien added. 200 rounds of machine gun ammunition. "Radio functioning normally," Miller concluded. "All systems operational." Thomas nodded, satisfied with their performance. "Well done, gentlemen. We've just made history." As the landing craft joined the small flotilla heading back toward England, Thomas opened his hatch to get some fresh air and a better view of the receding French coastline. McAllister appeared beside the tank, his face still blackened with combat cosmetics, but wearing a satisfied expression. "Successful operation, Captain Reynolds," the commando leader acknowledged. "Your crew performed admirably." "As did your men," Thomas replied. "Did you get what you needed?" McAllister patted the leather case now secured to his belt. "Complete technical documentation on the Freya system, including maintenance schedules and calibration data. Intelligence will be quite pleased." He glanced back toward the coast, where distant flashes and searchlight beams indicated the German response was now in full swing. "Bit too late to do them any good, though." "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "Debriefing, analysis, planning for the next operation," McAllister replied matter-of-factly. "This was just the beginning, Captain. A test of concept. There will be more raids, larger ones, as we build toward whatever the brass has in mind for the future." Thomas understood the implication. These raids were rehearsals for something bigger. Perhaps the major landing operation that Stalin had been demanding and Churchill had been promising. Iron Justice and her crew were helping to develop the tactics that might eventually be used on a much larger scale. "We'll be ready," Thomas assured him. McAllister nodded, then moved away to check on his men, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. As he watched the dark silhouette of occupied France fade into the night, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the political machinations of Colonel Harrison to the beaches of Normandy, Iron Justice had carried them through every challenge. And somewhere in that paradox of steel protecting fragile human life, Thomas had found his purpose and his place. The gentle roll of the landing craft and the rhythmic sound of waves against the hull eventually lulled Thomas into a light doze, his body releasing the tension of combat now that the immediate danger had passed. He dreamed of his father, of tanks advancing across French fields a generation earlier, of battles won and lost in the crucible of war. Dawn was breaking over the English Channel when Miller gently roused him. "Captain, we're approaching the English coast." Thomas blinked away sleep and focused on the horizon. The familiar shoreline of southern England was visible through the morning mist, a welcome sight after the tension of the night's operation. Standing watch from the turret, Thomas could see the other landing craft in their small flotilla, each carrying its Sherman tanks safely back to friendly territory. "All craft accounted for?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Miller confirmed. "No losses, minimal damage, mission complete." As they approached the naval facility that served as their base of operations, Thomas could see figures waiting on the dock. Among them was Captain Winters, likely eager for a first-hand account of the raid. "Prepare to disembark," Thomas instructed his crew. "Be ready for immediate debriefing." The landing craft maneuvered skillfully to the dock, its ramp lowering onto the concrete pier. Martinez guided Iron Justice down the ramp and onto English soil once more, the tank's tracks leaving wet marks on the pier as it rolled toward the assembly area. Edward Winters approached as Thomas climbed down from the turret, extending his hand in congratulation. "Well done, Reynolds. First American tank to engage the enemy in occupied Europe since the last war." "Won't be the last," Thomas replied, shaking the offered hand. "The concept is sound. Combined operations with armor support can work, even on a heavily defended coast." "Indeed," Winters agreed. "The higher-ups are quite pleased with the initial reports. But come, the debriefing team is waiting. They'll want every detail while it's still fresh." As Thomas followed Winters toward the briefing facility, he glanced back at Iron Justice, now being inspected by maintenance crews. The Sherman had performed flawlessly under pressure, just as the men who crewed her had. Whatever came next, Thomas knew they would face it together, the bond between them forged in fire and strengthened by shared danger. The war was far from over, but for the crew of Iron Justice, it had truly begun. Chapter 8, Home and Away. Portsmouth, England, August 1942. The Officers' Club at Combined Operations Base 7 hummed with conversation and cigarette smoke, the atmosphere more relaxed than Thomas had seen it in weeks. After 3 successful raids on German coastal installations, the tank crews and commando teams had earned a brief respite before their next mission. Men who had faced death together now shared drinks and stories, the camaraderie of combat transcending differences in nationality and branch of service. Thomas sat at a corner table with Captain McAllister and Captain Winters, reviewing the latest intelligence reports on German coastal defenses. Despite the nominally social setting, none of them could fully set aside the responsibilities of command. "They're reinforcing the entire sector," Winters observed, tapping a map spread before them. "Concrete bunkers, additional artillery, minefields. Our raids have certainly got their attention." McAllister nodded. "The price of success, each operation becomes progressively more difficult as they adapt to our tactics." "Which means we must adapt faster," Thomas added, studying the patterns of German deployment. "Their response times are improving, but they're still vulnerable to deception and misdirection." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a Royal Navy officer Thomas didn't recognize. The man saluted crisply. "Captain Reynolds, message for you, sir. Priority communication from London." Thomas accepted the sealed envelope with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Priority messages rarely brought good news in wartime. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen," he said, rising from the table. Finding a quiet corner, Thomas broke the seal and unfolded the message inside. As he read, his expression remained carefully neutral, though his mind raced with the implications of what he was reading. When he finished, he folded the paper precisely and returned to the table. "News from home?" Winters inquired, noting Thomas's thoughtful expression. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "It seems Colonel Harrison has been formally charged with treason, espionage, and endangering American personnel. The investigation has expanded to include Lawrence Whitfield and several other executives at Allied Defense Systems." McAllister raised an eyebrow. "The same Harrison you mentioned? Your former commanding officer?" Thomas had shared parts of his history with the British officers during their weeks of working together. "The same. Apparently my crew's testimony and the photographic evidence we gathered were instrumental in building the case." "Justice at last," Winters remarked, "though I imagine he won't go down without a fight." "No," Thomas agreed. "Men like Harrison never do." He hesitated, then added, "There's more. I've been ordered to return to Washington temporarily to provide additional testimony before a closed military tribunal. The news surprised both British officers. When? McAllister asked. As soon as possible. A transport leaves for the States tomorrow morning. Thomas's mixed feelings were evident in his voice. While vindication for his father's long-buried accusations brought satisfaction, the timing of the recall was problematic. Their next raid was scheduled in just 3 weeks, and preparation would be intensive. Your crew? Winters inquired. They're to remain here, continuing training while I'm away. Lieutenant Brooks from the 2nd Tank will temporarily assume command of Iron Justice. Thomas had complete confidence in his men's abilities, but the thought of them going into combat without him was unsettling. We'll look after them, McAllister assured him, though I doubt they need much looking after. They're among the best I've worked with. Thomas appreciated the commando leader's assessment. I should inform them immediately. He found his crew in the maintenance bay, where they were conducting routine checks on Iron Justice after their recent operation. Martinez was buried deep in the engine compartment, while Donovan and Miller calibrated the turret traverse mechanism. O'Brien sat nearby, methodically cleaning the breech of the main gun. Gentlemen, Thomas called, drawing their attention. A moment, please. The men gathered around their captain, immediately sensing the importance of his arrival. I've received orders to return to Washington, Thomas explained without preamble. The Harrison investigation has reached a critical phase, and my testimony is required before a military tribunal. The news was met with surprised silence, then a flurry of questions. How long will you be gone, sir? Miller asked. Approximately 2 weeks if all goes according to schedule. But the next operation? Donovan pressed, his weathered face showing concern. You'll proceed without me if I haven't returned in time. Lieutenant Brooks will take temporary command. Thomas met each man's eyes in turn. I have complete confidence in all of you. You know your jobs better than anyone. Martinez wiped his hands on a rag, his expression troubled. Sir, with respect, Iron Justice won't be the same without you in command. You'll adapt, Thomas assured him, just as you have adapted to everything else we've faced. O'Brien, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Will you be safe, Captain? Harrison has powerful friends, even now. The young loader's concern touched Thomas. I'll be careful, O'Brien. This is a legal proceeding, not a battlefield. Different rules, different dangers, but I've navigated Washington politics before. The crew nodded, accepting the situation, though clearly not happy about it. Thomas spent another hour reviewing operational details with them, ensuring they were prepared for his absence. When he finally departed, each man shook his hand firmly, the gesture conveying what words could not: their trust, respect, and determination to uphold the standards they had established together. The following morning, Thomas boarded a military transport plane at a Royal Air Force base north of Portsmouth. The flight would take him to Iceland, then Newfoundland, and finally to Washington, a journey of nearly 2 days, including refueling stops and potential weather delays. As the aircraft climbed above the English countryside, Thomas watched through the small window as the patchwork of fields and villages receded beneath cloud cover. Somewhere down there was his crew, continuing their preparations without him. The separation felt strange after months of living and fighting together in the closest of quarters. The journey proved as long and tedious as anticipated, with uncomfortable seats, bland food, and the constant drone of engines making rest difficult. When Thomas finally arrived in Washington, he was met by a military escort who drove him directly to the Pentagon, where the tribunal would be held. You'll be briefed by Colonel Marshall before the proceedings begin, the escort informed him as they navigated Washington traffic. The hearings are classified at the highest level. Thomas nodded, taking in the sights of the capital. Washington seemed untouched by war compared to London, with no bomb damage, no blackout restrictions, no visible signs of conflict beyond recruitment posters and the occasional military convoy. Yet beneath the surface, the machinery of war operated at full capacity, directing America's rapidly expanding military power around the globe. At the Pentagon, Thomas was escorted to a secure conference room where Lieutenant Colonel Marshall awaited him. The intelligence officer rose to greet him with a firm handshake. Captain Reynolds, thank you for coming on such short notice. Your testimony is crucial to our case. Of course, sir, though I admit the timing is challenging given our operational schedule in England. Marshall nodded understandingly. I apologize for the disruption, but events have accelerated rapidly. Harrison has secured powerful legal representation, and his attorneys are attempting to have the charges dismissed on procedural grounds. We need to present the strongest possible case immediately. I understand, Thomas replied. What should I expect? The tribunal consists of 3 senior officers from branches unconnected to either Harrison or the armored divisions. You will present your testimony regarding the testing incident, supported by the photographic evidence and your father's journal documenting the historical pattern. Marshall's expression was grim. Harrison's defense will attempt to discredit you, portray the incident as a misunderstanding, and challenge the relevance of your father's experiences from the previous war. And Whitfield? Being tried separately, but the cases are interconnected, evidence presented in one proceeding may be used in the other. Marshall checked his watch. The tribunal convenes in 1 hour. I suggest you review your notes and prepare yourself. Harrison will be present throughout. The prospect of facing Harrison again after months abroad was unsettling, but Thomas had expected it. This confrontation had been building since that first day at Camp Gordon when Harrison had made his animosity clear. When Thomas entered the hearing room an hour later, he immediately spotted Harrison seated at the defense table, flanked by 2 civilian attorneys in expensive suits. The colonel looked thinner than Thomas remembered, his face drawn with stress, but his eyes still held the same cold calculation. Their gazes met briefly across the room. Harrison showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening of his jaw, but the message was clear. The battle between them had reached its culmination. The tribunal members entered, 3 senior officers who regarded the proceedings with appropriate gravity. The charges against Harrison were read formally, each one more serious than the last. Treason for sharing technical information with potential enemies through corporate intermediaries. Espionage for gathering protected military data for private commercial interests. Reckless endangerment for deliberately placing American personnel at risk during unauthorized testing procedures. When Thomas was called to testify, he approached the witness stand with calm determination. For the next 2 hours, he provided a detailed account of the events at Camp Gordon, the suspicious modifications to the test parameters, and the direct evidence of Harrison's collaboration with Lawrence Whitfield. He spoke clearly and precisely, offering factual observations without emotion or speculation. Harrison's attorneys attempted to undermine his testimony through aggressive cross-examination, suggesting that Thomas had overreacted to standard testing procedures due to personal bias stemming from his father's history with Harrison. They questioned his crew's modifications to the Sherman's engine governor, implying that Thomas had deliberately sabotaged the test to discredit Harrison. Captain Reynolds, the lead attorney pressed, isn't it true that you had a predisposition to distrust Colonel Harrison based on family history rather than present facts? I formed my assessment of Colonel Harrison based on his actions and orders, Thomas replied evenly. The test parameters were altered without authorization, endangering my crew. Those are facts, not bias. Yet you modified your tank without permission, in direct violation of test protocols. How is that not sabotage of the evaluation process? We made contingency preparations based on observed anomalies in the test setup, Thomas countered. Those preparations saved lives when the 88mm gun was aimed directly at our vehicle instead of maintaining the prescribed offset. Throughout the exchange, Harrison remained impassive, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, but never directly engaging with Thomas. The colonel's composure cracked only once, when Thomas presented his father's journal as evidence of historical pattern. A flash of genuine anger crossed Harrison's face before the mask of professional detachment returned. The proceedings continued for 5 days, with Thomas recounting not only the testing incident, but the broader pattern of Harrison's behavior, including his attempts to isolate Thomas's crew and prevent them from reporting the safety violations. Other witnesses included Major Wilson, who testified regarding the intelligence investigation into Allied defense systems, and Colonel Matthews, who corroborated Thomas's account of events following the aborted test. On the 6th day, as Thomas waited to be recalled for final clarifications, a military aide approached him in the witness anteroom. "Urgent message from England, sir," the aide reported, handing Thomas a sealed envelope. Thomas opened it with growing concern, recognizing the Combined Operations Command code at the top of the message. The contents confirmed his fears. Operation Javelin accelerated stop. German reinforcements detected in target area. Stop launch window. 48 hours. Stop. Presence requested if possible. Stop Winterson. The timing couldn't have been worse. Operation Javelin was the most ambitious raid yet planned, targeting a German naval installation with significant anti-aircraft capabilities. Iron Justice and the other tanks would be critical to neutralizing those defenses to allow RAF bombers to strike the main facility. Thomas immediately sought out Colonel Marshall, explaining the situation and requesting permission to return to England. The tribunal is still in session, Marshall reminded him. Your final cross-examination is scheduled for tomorrow. My crew is going into combat, sir, Thomas replied firmly. My place is with them. Marshall studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll speak with the tribunal president. Your testimony has been comprehensive, and the photographic evidence speaks for itself. Perhaps we can make arrangements. After an hour of discussion with the tribunal officers, Marshall returned with news. You're cleared to depart immediately. A transport is being arranged to return you to England. He handed Thomas a sealed folder. These are your updated orders, authorizing your immediate return to active combat operations. Thank you, sir, Thomas said sincerely. What about Harrison? The tribunal will continue without you. Based on the evidence presented thus far, I believe the outcome is all but certain. Marshall's expression was grim but satisfied. Harrison's career is finished, and Whitfield will likely face civilian prosecution for corporate espionage. Justice may have been delayed, but it won't be denied. Thomas departed Washington that evening aboard a military courier flight, the urgency of his return granting him priority transportation. As the aircraft headed east over the Atlantic, he reviewed the operational details for Javelin, committing the updated intelligence to memory. The target was a coastal artillery battery protecting a U-boat pen, heavily defended but vital to German naval operations in the Channel. After a journey that seemed interminable, Thomas finally arrived at Portsmouth nearly 40 hours after receiving Winter's message. A staff car was waiting to rush him to the Combined Operations Base, where final preparations for Operation Javelin were underway. He found his crew in the ready room, reviewing maps and intelligence reports. Their faces registered shock, then delight as he entered. "Captain!" O'Brien exclaimed, rising to his feet. "We thought you were in Washington." "I was," Thomas confirmed, "but my place is here with Iron Justice and her crew." Donovan nodded approvingly. "Good timing, sir. We launch in 6 hours." Thomas immediately immersed himself in the operational briefing, quickly catching up on the changes made since the acceleration of the timeline. The target remained the same, but German reinforcements had been detected moving into the area, potentially compromising the original extraction plan. "We'll have a narrower window," Winters explained, as they reviewed the final details. 30 minutes on target, then immediate withdrawal. Any longer, and we risk being cut off by mobile reserves moving down from Caen. Thomas absorbed the information, mentally adjusting the tactical approach. "What about naval support during extraction?" "Limited," Winters admitted. "Most of our destroyers are engaged in convoy protection. We'll have 2 motor torpedo boats for fire support, but that's all." The constraints were significant, but not insurmountable. Thomas had complete confidence in his crew's abilities, especially now that they were together again. As the launch time approached, Thomas found a moment alone with his men beside Iron Justice, now prepped and ready for loading onto the landing craft. "I want to thank you all," he said simply. "Your testimony helped secure the case against Harrison. Justice is being served." "What about our former colonel?" Martinez asked. "Facing court-martial and likely prison," Thomas replied. "But that's behind us now. Our focus is the mission ahead." The men nodded, their expressions resolute. The past was settled, the future awaited. 6 hours later, under cover of darkness, the landing craft carrying Iron Justice approached the French coast once more. This time, their target was farther west, near the port town of Cherbourg. The artillery battery they sought to neutralize was positioned on a bluff overlooking the sea, its guns capable of engaging ships up to 15 miles offshore. 2 minutes to landing, Miller reported as the coast loomed ahead. Thomas stood in the commander's hatch, surveying the shoreline through night vision equipment. Unlike their previous raids, this beach was steeper, with less favorable terrain for tanks. They would need to advance quickly to a suitable rally point beyond the high water mark. "All stations report," Thomas ordered, maintaining the ritual that had served them well in previous operations. "Driver ready? Gunner ready? Loader ready? Bow gunner ready." "Iron Justice moving out," Thomas commanded as the landing craft's ramp lowered onto the beach. Martinez guided the Sherman ashore with practiced skill, navigating the steep gradient to reach firmer ground above the tide line. The other tanks in their small force followed, moving into predetermined formations as they assembled on French soil. "Commando teams report beach secured," Miller relayed from his radio. "Advancing to Phase 1 positions now." Thomas directed Iron Justice inland, following a narrow track that wound up toward the bluff where the artillery battery was situated. Intelligence indicated minimal defenses on the seaward approach, with German forces concentrated on the landward side where conventional attack would be expected. The night was clear, stars providing just enough illumination for navigation without compromising their stealth. As they advanced, Thomas could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire far to the east, unrelated to their operation, but a reminder that the war continued unabated across the continent. First checkpoint reached, Thomas reported as they arrived at a small clearing a kilometer inland. No contact. The commando teams were already moving ahead, securing the approach routes and eliminating any German sentries they encountered. So far, the operation was proceeding according to plan, the enemy unaware of the threat closing in on them. Thomas checked his watch. 23 minutes since landing. They were making good time. Advance to Phase 2 position, he ordered, and Iron Justice resumed its climb toward the battery. As they neared the final approach, Miller's radio crackled with an urgent message from the commando forward team. German patrol vehicle approaching from the north. Light armored car with mounted machine gun. Hold position, Thomas commanded. We'll deal with this. He directed Martinez to maneuver Iron Justice into a concealed position beside the road, partially hidden by a stand of trees. The Sherman's engine idled quietly as they waited for the German patrol to pass. Minutes later, the distinctive sound of a German SDKFZ-222 armored car became audible, its engine whining as it navigated the coastal road. Thomas waited until the vehicle was directly in their sights before giving the order. Gunner, target armored car, fire when ready. Donovan lined up the shot with his usual precision. The 75mm gun roared, its flash briefly illuminating the surrounding area. The shell struck the German vehicle squarely, transforming it into a fireball that lit up the night. Target destroyed, Donovan confirmed. All units, our position is compromised, Thomas broadcast to the force. Execute primary plan immediately. Full advance on objective. With the element of surprise lost, they abandoned stealth for speed. Iron Justice charged up the road toward the battery, its engine at full power. The other tanks in their force spread out, approaching the objective from multiple angles as planned. German defenders, alerted by the explosion, began to respond. Machine gun fire rattled against Iron Justice's armor as they closed on the battery perimeter. Flares burst overhead, casting harsh white light over the battlefield. Anti-tank gun, 2 o'clock, Miller warned, spotting the threat through his periscope. Thomas identified the position, a 50mm PaK-38, its crew rushing to bring it to bear on the approaching tanks. Gunner, priority target. Donovan traversed the turret, acquiring the target as O'Brien loaded an armor-piercing round. Ready. Fire! The Sherman's gun spoke again, the shell finding its mark with devastating effect. The anti-tank position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. Target neutralized, Donovan reported calmly, traversing to secondary targets. Iron Justice broke through the perimeter fence, leading the assault into the heart of the battery. German soldiers scattered before it, most unprepared for an armored attack from the sea. The coastal guns, massive 115mm weapons designed to engage ships, sat vulnerable on their fixed mounts, unable to traverse sufficiently to target the tanks now within their defensive perimeter. Commando demolition team moving in, Miller relayed. ETA 2 minutes. Thomas directed Martinez to position Iron Justice where it could provide optimal fire support for the commandos. The Sherman's machine guns engaged German infantry attempting to organize a defense, keeping them pinned while McAllister's men placed explosive charges on the primary targets. For 15 intense minutes, Iron Justice maneuvered within the battery complex, neutralizing resistance and protecting the demolition teams as they worked. The other tanks in their force performed similar roles, creating a protective cordon around the operations center. Charges set, Miller reported finally. Commandos withdrawing. Detonation in 60 seconds. All units, begin extraction, Thomas ordered. Maintain covering positions until demolition is complete. Iron Justice backed slowly toward the extraction route, its guns still trained on potential threat areas. As the commandos fell back in good order, multiple explosions ripped through the battery, disabling the massive coastal guns and destroying ammunition stores in spectacular chains of secondary detonations. Primary objective achieved, Thomas confirmed, watching the destruction through his binoculars. Begin full withdrawal to beach. As Iron Justice led the force back down the coastal road, Miller's radio crackled with an urgent warning. Captain, German reinforcements reported approaching from Cherbourg. Mechanized infantry estimated arrival at beach in 20 minutes. The timing was problematic. Their extraction was scheduled in 25 minutes, creating a potential overlap that could trap them on the beach. Thomas made a quick decision. Relay to all units. Accelerate withdrawal. Notify naval elements to advance extraction timeline if possible. The tanks increased speed, retracing their route to the landing zone. Behind them, the artillery battery burned brightly, illuminating the night sky and certainly visible for miles, including to the approaching German reinforcements. As they neared the beach, Thomas could see the landing craft already approaching shore, their crews having responded to the urgent request for earlier extraction. The commando teams were establishing defensive positions along the beach approaches, preparing to hold off the German reinforcements if necessary. Iron Justice to beach position, Thomas directed. We'll cover the northern approach. Martinez maneuvered the tank into position where its gun could command the road leading from Cherbourg. The other tanks took up similar covering positions, creating a defensive perimeter while the commandos began boarding the waiting craft. Thomas checked his watch anxiously. The German reinforcements would be arriving any minute, potentially catching them in the vulnerable process of extraction. Contact! Miller called suddenly. Vehicles approaching from the north, multiple signatures. Through his binoculars, Thomas could see a column of German transport trucks in light armor moving rapidly toward their position. At their current speed, they would reach the beach before extraction was complete. All tanks engage approaching column, Thomas ordered. Priority targets are lead and rear vehicles. Immobilize the column on the road. Iron Justice's gun spoke first, sending a high explosive shell into the lead vehicle. The truck exploded, blocking the narrow coastal road. Seconds later, the other tanks fired, targeting the rear of the column with similar results. Trapped between the burning vehicles, the German force began to deploy infantry, who moved toward the beach under covering fire from their support weapons. Commando teams report 60% embarked, Miller relayed. Estimated time to completion, 7 minutes. Continue engaging infantry, Thomas directed. Conserve ammunition for maximum effect. For the next tense minutes, Iron Justice and the other tanks maintained a steady fire on the German positions, preventing them from organizing an effective assault on the beach. The Sherman's machine guns were particularly effective at suppressing infantry movements, forcing the Germans to advance slowly and cautiously. German mortars deploying, Donovan warned, spotting the threat through his periscope. Shift fire to mortar positions, Thomas commanded. Don't let them range our extraction point. The tanks adjusted their fire, concentrating on the areas where German mortar teams were setting up. The 75mm guns proved devastating against these soft targets, eliminating several teams before they could bring effective fire to bear. Final commando elements embarking now, Miller reported. Tank extraction sequence beginning. Iron Justice will withdraw last, Thomas decided. Maintain covering fire while the other tanks embark. One by one, the other Shermans backed down the beach and up the ramps of their assigned landing craft. Iron Justice remained in position, its guns continuing to hold the German force at bay. As the last friendly tank secured for extraction, Thomas gave his final orders. Driver, reverse to extraction point. Maintain gun orientation toward enemy positions. Gunner, continue suppressing fire until we're aboard. Martinez skillfully backed the Sherman down the beach, maintaining their defensive posture as they approached the waiting landing craft. Donovan kept the main gun firing at regular intervals, forcing the Germans to keep their heads down during the critical final moments of withdrawal. Ramp in position, Miller confirmed as they reached the landing craft. Cleared aboard. Driver, reverse up ramp, Thomas ordered. Standard speed. Iron Justice backed smoothly up the ramp and into the landing craft, its tracks leaving deep imprints in the wet sand. The moment they were secure, naval personnel began raising the ramp and preparing for immediate departure. All units extracted, Miller reported with evident relief. Naval elements beginning withdrawal. As the landing craft pulled away from the beach, German mortar rounds began falling near their former position, too late to effect the extraction. Through his binoculars, Thomas could see German soldiers reaching the beach, firing ineffectually at the already distant vessels. Operation complete, Thomas confirmed to his crew. Outstanding performance, gentlemen. The return journey across the channel was mercifully uneventful, the small flotilla of landing craft maintaining formation as they headed back to England. Inside Iron Justice, the crew allowed themselves to relax slightly, the tension of combat gradually easing as the French coast receded behind them. Quite the welcome back, sir, Martinez observed with a grin. Straight from Washington to combat in under 12 hours. I wouldn't have missed it, Thomas replied sincerely. Harrison and his schemes seem very distant now, compared to what we're accomplishing here. O'Brien nodded thoughtfully. Justice for your father, and now we're carrying on his legacy in France. Seems right somehow. Thomas hadn't considered it quite that way, but the young loader had captured something essential. His father had fought to protect his men and uphold his principles, even at the cost of his career. Now Thomas was doing the same, though under very different circumstances and with far better support. As dawn broke over the channel, Thomas stood in the open hatch, watching the English coast gradually emerge from the morning mist. Behind them lay another successful mission. Another blow struck against Nazi Germany's defenses. Ahead lay more operations, more risks, more opportunities to make a difference in this global conflict. Iron Justice had carried them safely through another trial by fire. The tank, once just a machine assigned to them at Camp Gordon, had become something more, a symbol of their unity, their resilience, their shared purpose. Like the men who crewed her, Iron Justice had been tested and proven worthy, her armor scarred but unbroken, her spirit as indomitable as theirs. The war would continue with all its dangers and hardships, but Thomas Reynolds and the crew of Iron Justice would face it together, their bond forged in steel and strengthened by fire, ready for whatever challenges awaited them on the long road to victory.